Hey guys, they imprisoned their daughters in metal restraints, stitched their virtue back together with medical thread, and declared every feminine urge a sickness requiring treatment. The Victorian age was far more than elegant gowns, tea-time rituals, and romantic verse. This was a culture where passion was monitored, suppressed, and transformed into disturbing and unsettling regulations. Medical devices were disguised as treatments, transparent nightwear was deemed virtuous, and romantic correspondence could drag you into legal proceedings. Tonight, we're unlocking the door to the strangest intimate secrets of the Victorian period. Before we settle in, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I create here, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time zone you're in. It's always incredible to discover who's joining our community from across the globe. Go ahead and lower those lights, maybe switch on some white noise for that calming atmosphere, and let's dive into this exploration together. If you've ever imagined that Victorian matrimony centred around romance, candlelit dinners and leisurely strolls through misty gardens, you might want to reconsider before picturing what really transpired in the sitting rooms and physicians' offices of that time. Behind the silk gloves and ornate bustiers lay a degree of intimate surveillance that makes contemporary relationships seem completely unregulated by comparison. In Victorian England, purity wasn't simply cherished. It was examined, documented, and sometimes even manufactured. A young woman's value, her prospects, and her capacity to wed frequently depended on one invisible piece of tissue. The concept that a bride should be untouched wasn't revolutionary. But in Victorian culture, this notion transformed into a fixation clothed in scientific terminology, family honour, and masculine privilege. It transcended mere morality. It demanded proof. For certain households, particularly among the wealthy and middle classes, romantic letters and social position weren't sufficient. They required medical verification, and physicians, eager to accommodate, transformed into unofficial guardians of virtue. A young lady could be requested, frequently without her genuine understanding, to submit to an evaluation to confirm whether she remained untouched. These supposed purity examinations were typically organised by parents, not the intended groom. This was a business arrangement between households, disguised as parental protection, but motivated by social fear. The examination was clinical only in title. In reality, it was invasive and degrading. It's one matter to expect innocence from your daughter, quite another to delegate that expectation to a man with a medical degree and a moral superiority attitude. The notion that virginity could be confirmed visually or physically was, even at that time, scientifically questionable. But accuracy didn't matter. What counted was the appearance of certainty. Families trusted in the hymen the way they trusted in inheritance, something to be protected, verified, and transferred intact. In a culture where a woman's intimate history was treated like public records, any doubt became dangerous. That danger required elimination, and the methods were both medical and performative. Some young ladies facing tremendous pressure turned to approaches that were neither truthful nor secure. Artificial hymens, constructed from rubber or animal tissue, started circulating through certain discrete channels. These contraptions, sometimes labelled virginity restorers, were placed before the wedding night and engineered to create a small amount of bleeding. The objective was simple: a stain on the bedding held more weight than authentic experience. Contemporary concepts of trust and openness seem almost naive compared to the Victorian dependence on bodily theatre. These rubber inserts were challenging to acquire and frequently uncomfortable to employ, but they became a desperate solution for women who had lost their purity outside marriage, whether willingly or through force. For them, deception wasn't about romance, it was about staying alive. A single hint of doubt could destroy a wedding, devastate a family, or condemn a woman to permanent disgrace. The artificial hymen was a falsehood wrapped in latex, but it was also protection. In a world consumed with authority, women discovered how to fake compliance to preserve whatever limited independence they possessed. The focus on bleeding during the wedding night transformed an intimate moment into a public examination. The assumption was that the bedding would display evidence of purity, and this evidence could be inspected by the husband, or even, in unusual cases, the relatives. Some homes kept the stained fabric as proof of virtue accomplished. Others whispered privately about whether such evidence appeared. For women, this created a contradictory terror: to be close while being observed, and to demonstrate authenticity without margin for mistakes. What's especially disturbing is how few questioned the reasoning. Publications printed guidance on preserving maidenhood. Religious authorities cautioned that even self-touching could destroy innocence. Physicians warned about horseback riding or stair climbing. The hymen was handled like a delicate artifact, and its protection became a representation of an entire family's standing. That such an anatomical detail could bear the burden of so many assumptions is both ridiculous and harsh. Viewing it from our modern standpoint, we might find humour in the concept of a virginity certificate, but we continue living in a society where women's bodies are assumed to reveal truth, even when silence would be more compassionate. The vocabulary may have evolved, but the pressure remains. Now it conceals itself behind different words, different ceremonies, and different criticisms. Some women, naturally, avoided these expectations, but many couldn't, especially in respectable households. The daughter's body didn't belong to her. It belonged to her future spouse, to her father's pride, and to society's gossip. The only time it became hers was in secret, and even then, only temporarily. Sometimes girls would intentionally try to damage or break their hymens before marriage, hoping to prevent suspicion later. The reasoning was harsh, but it made sense within the system. To comprehend Victorian intimate morality, you must accept its inconsistencies. The era promoted modesty but required exposure. It celebrated innocence but made it a weight. It prized chastity but generated an underground market for illusions. The women trapped in this system understood better than anyone that their purity concerned others more than themselves. In this reality, silence meant safety, curiosity brought punishment, and errors lasted forever. Girls matured under the watch of mothers who recalled their wedding nights and fathers who behaved as if biology served as moral guidance. What strikes me most is how many women must have existed in terror of a single moment, a single night, a single question they couldn't answer without embarrassment. That type of fear doesn't vanish easily. It remains in the wallpaper, the journals, and the regulations nobody dares record anymore. As the sun disappeared after another refined dinner and the parlour filled with music and decorum, a young bride might sit upstairs in her room, wearing lace and jewellery, but thinking only of blood. She wasn't just a future wife. She was an examination, a representation, a vessel of assumptions. Victorian women weren't only expected to remain pure, they were expected to feel absolutely nothing. While the fixation with virginity controlled how a woman should enter marriage, the expectations didn't stop at the ceremony. They grew stronger. Once a woman became a wife, a different type of control emerged. Her purity was no longer measured by whether she had been touched. It was now evaluated by how she responded. In Victorian culture, feminine desire wasn't just discouraged. It was eliminated, rejected, and redefined as illness. A proper woman wasn't supposed to take pleasure in intimacy. She was expected to tolerate it. The perfect wife remained silent, humble, and obedient in every area, but particularly in the bedroom. Showing any type of physical enthusiasm could question her respectability. Even smiling too broadly or blushing around men could signal danger. And if she demonstrated too much interest in intimacy with her husband, that interest could be used against her. Passion for Victorian women wasn't a strength. It was a weakness needing correction. This belief influenced the most personal aspects of a woman's existence. Marital relations, rather than being a mutual bond, was handled like an obligation, a task performed for reproduction or masculine satisfaction. A wife might lie motionless, eyes shut, hands crossed over her abdomen, attempting not to respond. That represented the standard of virtue. To react was forgivable. To express pleasure was disgraceful. It was the only period in history when heavy breathing during intimacy could be viewed as a moral failing. There existed no secure environment for feminine sexuality to flourish. Girls weren't educated about their bodies beyond the requirement to remain covered and quiet. Husbands raised in the same restrictive environment often expected emotional distance as evidence of virtue. For some men, any sign that their wives might desire more seemed suspicious. Where did she learn to feel that way? Who authorized her to enjoy this? Such thoughts created a destructive pattern where curiosity became evidence and silence became security. Medical experts provided little assistance. They frequently made situations worse. The developing field of women's medicine in the 19th century treated feminine pleasure as a medical condition. If a woman displayed signs of arousal or simply voiced dissatisfaction with her married life, she could be diagnosed with various invented disorders. The most notorious among them was hysteria. This undefined and constantly expanding classification was used to explain everything from moodiness to sleeplessness to emotional outbursts. But often it was simply a reaction to being confined. The supposed treatment for hysteria involved what physicians described as pelvic massage. This was a process where the doctor would stimulate the patient's intimate areas by hand until she experienced what they diplomatically called paroxysm. These were obviously orgasms, but neither the physicians nor the patients were permitted to use that term. The procedure was deemed medical, not intimate, even though the result indicated otherwise. It's difficult to determine what's more ridiculous, the fact that women required a prescription to experience pleasure, or the fact that the doctors didn't even understand what they were providing. For many women, these visits were the only method to access any form of physical release. The physician's office became the sole location where their bodies could react freely, even if the setting was clinical and emotionally distant. Some women scheduled regular treatments, and some doctors started complaining about how lengthy the sessions became. This issue led to the creation of a device, the vibrator. Its initial function wasn't pleasure but productivity. It was a time-saving tool for physicians, not entertainment for patients. This type of medical manipulation worked alongside cultural suppression. Books, sermons, etiquette guides, and even clothing reinforced the concept that women were naturally less physical than men. It wasn't merely a preference, it was presented as fact. Publications argued that the feminine body was created for motherhood, not passion, that a woman who experienced strong desire was either sick, immoral, or secretly masculine in nature. The image of the ideal wife was someone who felt nothing and smiled politely while enduring it. Today, the same actions that once labelled a woman as abnormal are celebrated in therapy sessions and relationship guidance. The modern focus on shared pleasure would have appeared deeply revolutionary. In the Victorian sitting room, women who enjoyed intimacy were punished through invisibility. They couldn't discuss it, pursue it, or influence it. And for those who did, even within marriage, there was nowhere safe to land. They were excluded from polite society, or quietly reformed under the pretense of treatment. There's something particularly cruel about teaching someone to feel ashamed of their natural instincts. Victorian society taught women to fear their emotions, to doubt their bodies, and to withdraw at the moment they most needed connection. What began as simple modesty became silence, and silence became sickness. And when the sickness was finally labelled, the treatment was another form of control. Not all women accepted this destiny without resistance. Personal writings from the period show glimpses of defiance. Some wrote about longing, confusion or frustration hidden between recipes and household expenses. Others discovered ways to explore their bodies privately, though never without guilt. A few courageous voices published novels and essays under male names describing emotional hunger in coded language. These fragments suggest that the fire was never truly extinguished. It was only buried. What remains with me is how completely the system relied on pretense. Everyone understood at some level that women had desires, but pretending they didn't was simpler than changing the rules. So, the rules stayed, and the women vanished into them, bit by bit, until they no longer recognized themselves in culture's mirror. In the evening glow of the parlour, as husbands read newspapers and wives served tea, countless stories remained untold. A woman could wear silk, attend services, raise children, and still feel invisible within her own skin. Her pleasure didn't belong to her body didn't belong to her, and her silence was mistaken for contentment. What started as a rejection of feminine pleasure didn't end with women's desires in the bedroom. It spread into every aspect of bodily control, including the most private acts that happened without any partner present. In the Victorian mind, there was perhaps no greater danger to morality, health, and the nation's future than the solitary hand of a child or teenager beneath the covers. Self-pleasure, once considered by some ancient societies as harmless or even helpful, became a complete medical crisis. In the 19th century, Victorian physicians, ministers, teachers and parents joined forces in a mission to eliminate what they saw as a silent epidemic. The simple act of touching oneself wasn't just disapproved of, it was demonized. Medical books warned that self-pleasure would cause a cascading breakdown of body and mind. Blindness was the most well-known claim, but the list of supposed consequences went far beyond that. Convulsions, madness, heart failure, spinal deformation, memory loss, and moral corruption. These beliefs weren't just whispered among adults. They were published in books, preached from podiums, and taught to children in classrooms. Pictures showed hunched boys becoming lunatics. Girls who participated were described as future prostitutes or invalids. The warnings weren't symbolic. They were direct, and they created deep fear. A child who engaged in what we now recognize as normal development could be told they were destroying their own spirit. In more extreme homes, this panic became physical. Parents started searching for ways to prevent their children from touching themselves. At night, some resorted to sewing nightgown sleeves closed so hands couldn't move freely. Others tied hands to bedposts or used sleeping gloves that were rigid and uncomfortable. The goal was to build barriers between the body and itself. The Victorian answer to self-discovery was to wrap it in fabric, bind it in shame, and hope the urge disappeared. For boys, metal rings with inward-pointing spikes were sometimes placed around the penis. These devices, often called anti-self-pleasure rings, were designed to cause pain if arousal happened. More complex mechanisms involved belts with locks, sometimes made of leather and strengthened with metal plates. These were fitted to prevent access completely. Girls weren't exempt either. Some wore chastity devices resembling small cages that covered the pelvic region. These tools weren't sold in novelty stores. They were marketed through medical catalogues, prescribed by doctors, and ordered by concerned but frightened parents. Looking at this from today's perspective, it's like trying to prevent a sneeze by stitching someone's nostrils closed. The reasoning was primitive, the technology was brutal, and the price was emotional destruction. Children grew up believing their bodies were dangerous, that their instincts were filthy, that their nighttime thoughts proved corruption. Some physicians built careers treating the supposed effects of self-pleasure. Clinics for nervous conditions often treated patients who had admitted to self-touching. The treatments ranged from cold baths to dietary restrictions to electrical shock therapy. Some even prescribed circumcision, not for medical or religious purposes, but as a form of deterrent. For girls, the removal of the clitoris was sometimes recommended. These procedures were justified as therapeutic, but they were based in punishment. The most disturbing aspect of all this is that these beliefs were often supported by science as it existed then. Respected medical publications printed articles claiming that fluid loss weakened the body and led to early death, that feminine stimulation caused internal displacement, that repeated self-abuse would harm the nervous system. These ideas weren't easily challenged because they came from authority, and when authority is frightened, the body becomes its battlefield. There was also a class aspect to the panic. In wealthier families, the shame was often medicalized. In poorer families, it was moralized and punished more directly. But in both situations, the result was identical. Children learned early that their bodies weren't theirs to explore. Any move toward independence was blocked, whether by fear, fabric, or steel. What stays with me is how desperately society wanted to separate people from the parts of themselves that felt pleasure. Religious institutions contributed too. Sermons about purity often included warnings about private sin. Confession booths filled with young people's guilt. Mothers prayed over their children's beds. Fathers spoke of honor and discipline, but rarely of understanding. The message was repeated so frequently that it became internalized. Many adults carried this shame into their marriages, into their parenting, and even into their final years. In quieter homes, where the tools of punishment were missing, the silence could be equally powerful. A child who asked about their body might be met with scolding or cold disapproval. Some learned to hide, others stopped questioning, and that silence became generational, passed down like family silver, but far heavier to bear. There were, however, some voices of resistance even within the period. A few progressive physicians started challenging the claims linking self-pleasure to madness. They argued that the harm came not from the act itself, but from the guilt imposed upon it. These views were often dismissed as radical, but they planted seeds for future change. Later in the century, intimate reformers would start pushing back harder. But for most of the Victorian era, the fear remained solidly in place. Today, we live in a time when self-knowledge is considered healthy, and education about the body is encouraged in many places. But the shadow of that era persists. In some communities, the shame still exists. In others, the conversation remains forbidden. What the Victorians created wasn't just a moment of fear. It was a legacy of silence that continues shaping how people relate to themselves. As night fell over the manicured lawns and gaslit bedrooms of Victorian England, a young boy might lie in bed with his hands trapped in stitched sleeves. A girl might shift uncomfortably under a rigid metal plate. Neither one knew that what they felt was natural. They only knew it was forbidden. By the time self-pleasure had been criminalised and suppressed in Victorian homes, the medical world had already discovered a workaround. It didn't look like freedom. It appeared at first glance like treatment, and it came in the form of a strange mechanical device that buzzed, hummed, and promised to restore a woman's emotional stability. The vibrator, a tool now connected with independence and pleasure, was born in the back rooms of clinics under the banner of medicine. The concept started with hysteria, a term used broadly to diagnose any behaviour that strayed from the ideal image of a quiet, obedient Victorian woman. If a wife cried too much, she had hysteria. If she was restless, unhappy, bored, angry, aroused, or even just unusually chatty. The diagnosis applied. Hysteria had no clear symptoms and no biological marker, but it was regularly cited as the most common condition among women. And like any condition, it required a cure. The solution, according to the physicians of the time, was what they called pelvic massage. A doctor would stimulate a woman's intimate areas manually until she reached what they referred to as paroxysm. The term avoided any connection with sexuality, but the outcome was undeniably an orgasm. Picture an era where medical professionals gave women orgasms without ever admitting that's what they were doing. They genuinely believed they were relieving pressure in the uterus, calming the nervous system or correcting an imbalance. These procedures were often performed without privacy, sometimes in physicians' offices that also served male patients. There was no emotional context, no discussion of desire or connection. It was clinical, detached, and mechanical. Yet for many women, it was the only way they experienced physical release. Some even developed preferences for certain physicians and returned regularly for treatment. The growing demand placed a heavy burden on doctors who soon started complaining about how long the procedures took. That burden sparked innovation. To save time and effort, inventors designed the first electro-mechanical vibrator in the late 19th century. Powered by batteries or foot pedals, these devices allowed for faster, more consistent stimulation. They were marketed not as intimate objects, but as health appliances. Vibrators were advertised in women's magazines, listed in medical catalogues, and displayed in storefronts under the label of therapeutic instruments. Some looked like sewing machines, others resembled hair dryers. Their true purpose was hidden in plain sight. It's as if the entire nation agreed to keep a secret, even from itself. Nobody dared say what these machines really accomplished, but everyone seemed to understand. Housewives used them in parlours, bathrooms, or bedrooms under the pretense of managing nerves or headaches. The devices were labelled massagers or tonic vibrators. Physicians encouraged their use at home, and some even offered demonstrations. Meanwhile, society clung to the illusion that sexuality remained unspoken and untouched. This strange arrangement revealed the hypocrisy at the core of Victorian intimate repression. The same society that prohibited open discussion of feminine desire had, through its twisted logic, made pleasure part of medical routine. A woman couldn't speak of arousal, but she could schedule an appointment to treat her hysteria. She couldn't discuss her needs with her husband, but she could press a machine to her pelvis each evening without raising questions. It was repression through redirection. The vibrator became, accidentally, a symbol of contradiction. It represented the collision between control and curiosity, silence and sensation. It existed because society refused to admit that women had bodies capable of pleasure, and it persisted because women found ways to use it anyway. What fascinates me most is how medical denial became a kind of accidental liberation, even if nobody was willing to say it out loud. For those who did question the practice, there was little room for discussion. Critics were dismissed as immoral or unscientific. Serious women who spoke too openly were labelled indecent. The language of the time was carefully coded to avoid direct acknowledgement. Medical texts described the process in vague anatomical terms. Advertisements used words like soothing, invigorating, or restorative. Even among users, the real reason for the device was often never spoken aloud. It was simply understood. By the early 20th century, vibrators had become widespread in middle-class households. Some were passed between generations, treated like family heirlooms. Their popularity eventually attracted the attention of those outside the medical world. When they began appearing in early adult films, the illusion collapsed. Suddenly, these therapeutic devices could no longer hide behind health claims. Physicians began to distance themselves from the practice, and the vibrator was reclassified not as a medical tool, but as a private item. Its exile from the physician's office marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The irony is hard to ignore. A device born from repression became one of the first widely available tools of feminine physical agency. Yet for decades its users were never allowed to say what it was really for. Compared to today, where entire industries market self-pleasure openly, the Victorian approach looks like an elaborate charade staged in corsets and candlelight. But that charade mattered. It provided cover, and in a world that punished honesty, cover was survival. The vibrator's history is more than a footnote. It's a window into how society policed the body while still feeding its needs. It shows how control often produces the very thing it fears. Victorian authorities wanted to suppress desire. Instead, they automated it. They denied women a voice, but gave them a hum. And in that quiet vibration, some women heard something they had never heard before, their bodies speaking without shame. Even now, the shadow of that silence lingers. Some people still feel discomfort discussing these devices, as if pleasure must still be justified by pain or diagnosis. But history remembers, and it reminds us that repression doesn't always erase. Sometimes it reappears in the strangest forms. A brass machine on a parlour shelf, a catalogue page tucked into a drawer, a quiet buzz behind a locked door. As the gaslights dimmed in another parlour and a woman drew the curtains in her private room, the hush of propriety was interrupted by something new. It didn't come with ceremony or shame. It came with a quiet pulse disguised as medicine but felt as something far more personal. Long before machines hummed in quiet bedrooms and medical catalogues offered solutions to unspoken desires, the diagnosis that made it all possible had already taken root. Hysteria in Victorian society wasn't just a medical term, it was a cultural explanation for everything that made men uncomfortable. A woman cried too often. Hysteria. She resisted her husband's authority. Hysteria. She wanted something nobody would name. Still hysteria. It became the umbrella under which all disobedience, emotion, and sexuality could be hidden and dismissed. The word itself came from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. That origin shaped everything. Victorian physicians believed that the uterus had a mind of its own. They described it as a wandering organ capable of floating to the lungs, pressing on the heart, or drifting toward the brain. This supposed migration explained every symptom they couldn't understand. Fainting, insomnia, irritability, melancholy, even coughing. If a woman had it, her womb was probably to blame. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it passed for science. Elite physicians taught these ideas in universities. Popular health manuals reinforced them, and ordinary people absorbed them without question. The feminine body was framed as unstable by nature, always on the verge of collapse and requiring constant management. A man's sadness could inspire verse. A woman's would prescribe her bed confinement and medical procedures. It's difficult not to find absurd the notion of a womb wandering the body like a drifting balloon. Yet this delusion governed actual existence. It granted physicians authority to order whatever they deemed appropriate. And what they deemed appropriate was frequently degrading. Women received instructions to remain inside, to rest motionless in shadowed chambers, to cease reading, to quit questioning. The more still they stayed, the less disruption they supposedly created. Sometimes they were forbidden even basic conversation for extended periods. The remedies prescribed for hysteria matched the strangeness of the condition itself. Rest cures gained popularity, requiring weeks of seclusion, simple meals and complete inactivity. Women couldn't sit upright, speak openly, or even nourish themselves. The objective was breaking their will quietly, disguised as medical care. Some travelled to coastal retreats or therapeutic facilities. Others remained in their bedrooms with shuttered windows, their sanity slowly unravelling. Then physical interventions began. Bowel purges, blood draining, frigid baths, and intimate massage formed the hysteria treatment arsenal. One technique involved washing the womb with cold liquid delivered through an extended metal instrument. Another used electrical stimulation applied to legs and lower torso. Most notorious was the pelvic massage, performed with doctors' hands or later using mechanical devices. These procedures occurred without emotional understanding, without acknowledging arousal, and frequently without permission. The most peculiar aspect was physicians' sincere belief in their noble work. They imagined they were controlling wild energy, soothing female nerves, and restoring proper social order. Actually, they were simply channeling pleasure through a backdoor labelled medicine. Women departed feeling calm, sometimes content, and often wanting to return. But nobody acknowledged the truth. Naming it would mean admitting female sexuality existed with its own requirements. Hysteria's diagnostic power lay not in precision but in utility. It perfectly silenced opposition. A woman challenging her spouse could be deemed hysterical. So could a daughter rejecting marriage, a widow enjoying freedom excessively, a nun fasting too much, a wife seeking affection. All could be grouped under identical diagnosis, confined to similar rooms and given the same quieting treatments. Unlike modern therapy that aims to comprehend, the Victorian approach sought erasure. Emotions became infections, longings became fevers, mourning became hormonal dysfunction. A woman's inner world wasn't considered legitimate unless measurable, fixable, or calmed by machinery. The more she resisted, the more her resistance validated the diagnosis. It was an inescapable cycle that closed silently around her. Not every woman submitted passively. Some maintained journals revealing their understanding of the situation. They performed compliance to gain freedom. Others discovered ways to exploit the system, faking symptoms to avoid different forms of domination. A few turned hysteria's language against itself, publishing writings and verse under masculine pseudonyms, using the diagnosis metaphorically. These represented rare rebellions in a culture demanding submission not through violence, but through whispers. Hysteria's social influence reached beyond medical facilities. It appeared in literature, theatrical devices, and masculine humour. Comic illustrations depicted women fainting in tight corsets or weeping over romance novels, always too delicate for reality. These pictures concealed the truth that many women existed in silent desperation, their lives moulded by diagnoses they couldn't refute. Even now, hysteria's echoes persist. Women's feelings remain more susceptible to being medicalized, dismissed, or considered exaggerated. What strikes me most profoundly is how easily knowledge can be distorted into submission when serving social anxieties. The doctors weren't villains. In their perception, they were guardians of stability. But the stability they guarded cost female independence, and that protection's legacy remains visible in quietness, in embarrassment, in the inherited terror of being excessive. As another evening passed behind heavy drapery and solid furniture, a woman might rest in a cushioned room, her hands folded properly across her belly. She'd been instructed to recuperate, to behave, to stay silent. A nurse monitored her heartbeat. A doctor arranged her next treatment. Nobody inquired about her feelings, only whether she'd improved. Next, we'll exit the clinic and explore the hidden, secretive corners of Victorian streets and workshops where different desires took shape, captured not in medical records but in photographs, nude images sold discreetly, female forms wrapped in silk and mythology, and a marketplace of fantasy presented as scientific study. During daylight, Victorian England presented itself as a nation of respectability. Mannerisms were exact, movements were restrained, and propriety was wrapped in layers of cloth and ceremony. Women moved with downcast eyes and folded hands. Men conversed in controlled voices, referencing religious texts or scientific knowledge. But beneath this orderly surface, another reality existed, one not ruled by etiquette, but by fascination. It thrived in darkened storefronts, hushed invitations, and pictures that could never appear in public. That reality was constructed from photographs. Photography reached Britain promising authenticity and progress. Initially, it served respectable functions. Family images, royal assignments, landscapes documenting the empire. But soon the same camera capturing a child's celebration began capturing something entirely different. Bodies, arrangements, flesh. And not solely for medical textbooks or sculptural references. A new marketplace developed, discreet yet expanding. Pictures of unclothed women printed in brown or silver tones began circulating through hidden shops and personal collections. These weren't marketed openly. The workshops producing them operated quietly, often behind curtain dividers or false business identities. Access came through recommendation. A gentleman might arrive for a portrait and be offered, behind locked doors, a different sort of portfolio. Inside were pictures of women arranged in classical tableaus covered in transparent fabric, positioned on artificial rocks, illuminated to suggest atmosphere rather than explicit detail. The form was completely visible, but identities were not. The women became inspirations, never individuals. It requires a specific kind of contradiction to condemn the female figure publicly while secretly acquiring it in print. That contradiction defined an entire category of purchasers. Many claimed the photographs served educational purposes. They labelled them studies in posture or illumination. Others argued they were essential for artists perfecting their craft. But the reality was evident in the quantity of copies sold and the diversity of poses created. This wasn't purely artistic expression, it was longing, filtered through respectability to disguise the motivation. The women in the pictures were seldom identified as individuals. They received titles like Nature at Peace or Dawn's Awakening. Some were described as deities or legendary figures. A leafy crown or translucent veil could transform any woman into an acceptable subject. The observer wasn't meant to imagine her appetite or anxiety, only her shape, her role in fantasy. Her body as motionless art. The models were frequently women with limited options. Performers without employment, domestic workers dismissed for misconduct, prostitutes seeking safer income. Some were promised confidentiality, though it was seldom maintained. Others posed once and vanished. Their pictures endured, exchanged person to person like artifacts from a secret faith. What captivates me is how these women, stripped of identity and voice, still met the observer's stare. Not with temptation, not with humiliation, but with the reality of their existence. Compared to today, when pictures are created instantly and shared globally, the process then was calculated and personal. A single photograph demanded time, stillness, chemistry, and precision. The outcome was not accidental. It was selected, and it frequently resided in drawers hidden inside hollowed books or behind false compartments in closets. Husbands might store them beneath jewellery. Doctors might place them beside medical journals. Nobody discussed them, but nobody discarded them. One of the more creative justifications for these pictures was their alleged anatomical purpose. Collections of nude photographs labelled as medical studies or artistic references were compiled and distributed to artists and physicians. These sets contained dozens of photos of the same woman standing, kneeling, lying down, reaching upward, or leaning forward. Descriptions mentioned bone structure or muscle definition, but the composition was not medical. It was calculated, evocative, always careful to emphasize curves, not anatomy. These books weren't delivered to hospitals. They were bought by private gentlemen. They sat in personal libraries between volumes of classical literature or natural philosophy. Visitors might be shown one or two under the pretense of scholarly interest. Nobody questioned where the model originated. Nobody wondered what became of her after the session. She existed for the photograph, and the photograph existed for the fantasy of possession. What gave these pictures their influence was not merely the nudity, but the denial surrounding it. They were created in a society claiming women should never appear this way, that clothed women were sacred, that modesty defined character. Yet here they were, catalogued and traded, their bodies preserved by the same people who publicly condemned them. What remains with me is how easily regulations can bend when the person breaking them possesses the correct language. The contradiction stayed unspoken. On the streets, a woman could be shamed for revealing her ankle. In the studio, she could remove everything except a ribbon and still be considered refined. If the lighting was gentle and the title poetic, the rules remained unchanged. Only the location differed, and the cost. Some women used the opportunity for limited control. They negotiated better payment, selected their poses, rejected certain accessories. Others endured the process silently, hoping the money would sustain them through winter. There are accounts of women returning to studios repeatedly, not just for survival, perhaps also for acknowledgement. In a world denying their thoughts, their images became the only visibility they could manage. But danger was constant. If discovered, a woman could lose employment, be abandoned by family, or branded immoral. Her image could be reused without consent. It might appear in a shop display years later, misattributed, divorced from truth. The camera offered no security, only exposure. In today's context, it would be like sending a private message and having it published as a postcard. The betrayal was not technological, it was cultural. The shame was not in the position, it was the hypocrisy, and it remains recognizable in ways we might not acknowledge. As another evening drew its veils in a quiet Victorian household, a man might settle into his study, open a drawer, and lift a folder of pictures wrapped in cloth. He would not mention them. He would not display them to his wife, but he would preserve them. Not because he believed in their artistic merit, but because they contained what society refused to acknowledge. Next, we'll move from the picture to the ceremony, to the marriage bed, where evidence was required, emotion was unwelcome, and a single night determined a woman's value in blood. Well before the wedding night arrived, its pattern had already been established. The promises were spoken, the ring given, and the bride transferred like a family treasure. But for many Victorian women, the actual trial came not at the altar, but in the bedroom. That night, under flickering light and between layers of embroidered fabric, she was not merely expected to complete a marriage. She was expected to demonstrate something, and her body would provide the proof. Victorian culture connected virtue to biology with merciless accuracy. A woman's worth as a spouse was not determined by her compassion, intellect, or faithfulness. It was determined by the presence or absence of blood on the wedding linens. The hymen was regarded not just as tissue, but as evidence. If blood appeared, it verified purity. If it did not, inquiries began. The bedsheet became a witness, the mattress a tribunal, and the husband its magistrate. For many brides, the pressure was overwhelming. They had been cautioned about this night for years, usually through unclear metaphors and whispered counsel. Some were told to remain still and bear it. Others were encouraged to pray. Almost none were informed what to expect, physically or emotionally. It requires a harsh kind of reasoning to transform intimacy into an examination and a woman's pain into another's comfort. The first night of marriage was not about connection, it was about verification. The morning after, families sometimes demanded evidence. In certain homes, the stained sheet was shown to relatives or staff, a crude declaration of preserved purity. If the sheet stayed clean, the bride was blamed. Perhaps she had been with another man. Perhaps she was frigid. Perhaps she was dishonest. Almost never was it considered that bleeding might not happen, that the hymen might already have stretched or torn from activity, horseback riding, or nothing at all. The notion that female pleasure should be absent from this moment was deeply embedded. A wife was expected to yield, not enjoy. Any indication of enthusiasm was suspect. If she relaxed or smiled, it raised concerns. Where had she learned to act that way? With whom had she practiced? This perverted logic transformed a natural human reaction into an alarm. The safest bride was the quiet one, still innocent and preferably frightened. Some men, terrified of disappointment or scandal, sought certainty beforehand. They visited brothels not for lust alone, but for confidence. Prostitutes were asked to enact wedding night scenarios, to pretend to be virgins, to lie back and bleed on command. These rehearsals gave the men assurance, or at least the appearance of readiness. But it also deepened the contradiction. They sought experience for themselves while demanding ignorance from their future wives. Compared to the mutual vulnerability modern couples often seek, The Victorian wedding night resembled a one-sided inspection. One person arrived with expectations, the other with fear. There was no space for curiosity, no time for discovery. Only performance, assessment, and the quiet hope that no one would ask the wrong question at breakfast. Medical professionals added to the confusion. Some doctors published manuals for husbands describing what to expect and how to interpret it. These texts often included charts or diagrams, warning signs of deception and advice on managing a nervous bride. The idea that the first act of married life might be painful, awkward, or even traumatic was rarely mentioned. Instead, the emphasis was on the blood, compliance, silence. For women, this silence extended beyond the bedroom. They were not expected to discuss their emotions, their fears, or even their discomfort. If a bride wept the next day, she was told to be thankful. If she recoiled from her husband, she was advised to pray. The language of trauma did not exist. Neither did the concept of consent in the modern sense. She was now a wife. That was sufficient. What disturbs me most is how entire generations of women were taught that their pain was a normal part of beginning a life with someone. They were told that love came later, that pleasure was for other types of women, that a wife's duty was to endure in silence. The bruises on her legs were not mentioned. The tears on her pillow were not seen. The sheets were washed and folded without comment. The ritual around blood was not limited to aristocratic homes. It filtered through every social level, though with varying degrees of formality. In some working-class families, mothers-in-law inspected the bedding. In wealthier homes, housekeepers were instructed to observe and report. Stories circulated in newspapers and etiquette manuals, reinforcing the idea that a marriage's success began with a mark on cotton. Even in households where no one checked, the expectation remained. Women carried it like a burden on their shoulders. They feared what might happen if they failed this unspoken test. Some inserted objects to simulate bleeding. Others confessed to sins they had not committed, convinced it was better to be punished than suspected. In every version of the story, the body became both the battleground and the scapegoat. Some husbands, despite their own experience, failed to recognize their hypocrisy. They demanded purity while remembering their nights in establishments of ill repute. They praised chastity but mocked prudishness. They wanted wives who knew nothing but pleased like professionals. This double standard shaped not only expectations, but the very nature of desire itself. Those few women who did enjoy the act, who felt arousal or warmth, often learned to conceal it. They turned their heads, bit their lips, stayed quiet. To react was to risk everything. A laugh could be mistaken for knowledge, a sound for guilt. In the language of the time, there was no way for a woman to say, "I want this," and still be seen as virtuous. In today's conversations about mutual consent and emotional safety, the Victorian wedding night feels like a courtroom staged inside a bedroom. The goal was not connection, it was confirmation. The sheet was not just linen, it was judgment, doctrine and myth all woven together. As the lamps dimmed and the hallways fell silent, the young bride might lie beneath the unfamiliar covers, staring at the ceiling, her husband beside her, her body aching, her thoughts racing. She had done what was required. Whether it brought joy or pain did not matter. What mattered was the outcome, folded at the foot of the bed. Next, we'll move deeper into the contradictions of control. Where society prohibited passion officially but fed it secretly, where kisses happened through keyholes, where games of innocence turned quickly into displays of hidden desire. Behind the velvet drapes of sitting rooms and the carefully manicured hedges of public gardens, there existed a love that was never meant to be voiced. In Victorian England, same-sex desire was not just discouraged, it was criminal, not in the vague sense of moral disapproval, but through strict written law. For men especially, expressing affection toward another man could mean the end of a career, a lifetime of exile, or imprisonment with hard labour. What was considered an act of intimacy in private became a public offence if ever discovered. The law did not pretend to be subtle. Under statutes like the Offences Against the Person Act, same-sex activity was described as a form of gross indecency. It was placed alongside acts of violence and assault, as if to suggest that love itself could be dangerous. Men accused of engaging in such relationships were arrested, tried, and often sentenced to prison. Some were sent to penal colonies overseas. Others were publicly shamed, their names printed in newspapers, their reputations destroyed overnight. One of the most notorious cases was that of Oscar Wilde, a celebrated playwright and literary figure. Wilde was charged and convicted not because he harmed anyone but because he loved men. His trial was a national spectacle. The prosecution introduced his letters and poems as evidence of criminal behaviour. The sentence was 2 years of hard labour. When Wilde emerged from prison, he was physically broken and socially ruined. His writings continued, but his life never recovered. It requires a special cruelty to turn affection into evidence and desire into confession. Victorian society did not care about the subtlety of love. It cared about order. Anything that challenged the image of the proper English gentleman was seen as dangerous. And same-sex attraction, especially among men, was framed not just as inappropriate, but as a sign of deviance, perversion, or disease. To survive, those who felt such desire had to speak in code. A hidden vocabulary developed, allowing people to recognize each other without drawing attention. One of the most fascinating of these was the language of flowers. In this silent code, a green carnation pinned to a lapel might signal same-sex interest. A red rose might mean longing. A gift of violets could suggest loyalty or sorrow. Entire conversations took place through bouquets, carefully arranged and nervously delivered. Compared to the open identities and pride parades of today, these floral whispers seem impossibly fragile. But for those who used them, they were lifelines in a world where a wrong glance could spark an arrest. Secrecy was not just a strategy, it was survival. Gatherings were held in private homes. Invitations extended only to trusted friends. Letters were written with aliases, then burned. Love was hidden in poetry, encrypted in metaphor, and carved into tree bark under false names. For some, these quiet efforts were not enough. They built entire worlds behind closed doors. Secret clubs, often presented as literary circles or charitable societies, became meeting places for those who lived beyond the law. In London and other cities, underground groups gathered under the guise of discussing art, theatre or spiritualism. But behind the formalities, connections were made. Friendships became something deeper. A glance across a parlour, a touch beneath the table, a moment of shared silence. These spaces were not always safe. They were sometimes infiltrated, raided, or betrayed. Informants were paid, letters were intercepted. Even vague rumours could lead to police scrutiny. But the clubs kept reappearing, taking new forms. Some operated inside theatre communities. Others disguised themselves as art salons. The goal was not revolution, it was refuge. For women, the situation was both simpler and more complicated. Female same-sex relationships were not criminalised in the same way, largely because lawmakers refused to believe they could exist. Queen Victoria herself reportedly dismissed the idea as nonsense. As a result, women had a slightly larger margin for emotional intimacy. They could live together, write passionate letters, even sleep in the same bed without immediate suspicion. But if the relationship became too visible, too expressive or too physical, it risked being pathologized. Female desire was often redirected or erased. Some women were institutionalized for unnatural attachments. Others were forced into marriage. The lack of a legal definition did not mean freedom, it meant silence. A silence filled with half-finished poems, destroyed diaries and stories told only in code. What lingers most is how many lives were lived halfway, never fully spoken aloud. The Victorians left behind countless letters that hint at passion, but stopped short of clarity. They built friendships that crossed into love, but never dared say so in writing. Their histories are made of ellipses, of pauses, of shadows. Despite the risks, these connections endured. Some couples managed to build lives together cloaked in ambiguity. They travelled as companions or cousins. They shared homes and bank accounts, raised pets, and kept their love alive through ritual and repetition. Their survival required discipline, not only of emotion but of language. They became experts in not being seen, even when everyone was watching. The danger extended beyond the law. Social exile was often more immediate than any court sentence. Families disowned, employers dismissed, churches condemned. Even among friends, a revelation could mean the end of trust. There was no safety net, no advocacy, only luck, silence, and sometimes cleverness. In private moments, love still found a way. A note slipped into a glove, a meeting at dusk by the river, a single photograph hidden behind a painting. These fragments became enough, not because they satisfied, but because they sustained. In today's context, with laws protecting same-sex marriage in many countries and open celebration in others, the Victorian system feels like a cold, closed room. But for those who lived inside it, that room was home, and they made space within it, folding down the edges of themselves until they could stolst. Breathe without being noticed. As the night closed in over London rooftops and gas lamps flickered against narrow alleys, two men might walk on opposite sides of the street, their hands brushing only in imagination. Or two women might lie awake in shared silence, each pretending the other was asleep. Love in this world was an unfinished sentence. Next, we'll step into a stranger tradition still hidden beneath the polished surface of aristocratic entertainment. Parties where kisses were stolen through a hole in a door, where masks covered more than faces, and where desire was turned into a game that everyone denied playing. After the solemnity of the wedding night and the quiet rituals of inspection, desire in Victorian England often found more playful, though no less controlled outlets among the upper classes. Where manners were rehearsed and every fork had its place, there still existed a hunger for excitement. This hunger did not appear in scandalous novels or dimly lit alleys alone. It crept into parlours and drawing rooms disguised as party games, and one of the strangest among them involved nothing more than a door, a keyhole, and a carefully timed kiss. These games were not played in slums or brothels. They belonged to the social calendars of the aristocracy. Evening gatherings filled with tea, music, and polite conversation occasionally gave way to more curious entertainments after midnight. Among the most talked about was the so-called keyhole kiss. It began innocently enough. The host announced a game. The curtains were drawn. A door was locked between two rooms with only a single keyhole connecting them. And then the blindfolds were brought out. Guests, usually of both sexes and all stations within the house, were invited to participate. One person stood on each side of the door. One side was designated for the kisser, the other for the receiver. Neither knew who was on the other side. A guide, often the host or a trusted guest, would gently position the participants. The lips would meet through the tiny circular hole, soft and unseen. It was a moment of contact with no context. It requires a particularly strange mindset to design a game where anonymity becomes arousal and guessing wrong is half the fun. But that was the point. It wasn't just about kissing. It was about uncertainty. The thrill came from not knowing whose lips had just met yours. A friend, a stranger, a rival, a servant. For a brief moment, everyone was equal and equally exposed. The game was treated as harmless entertainment. The guests chuckled, turned red, or pretended to be scandalised. Yet beneath the amusement lay an electric tension. This veil of secrecy let forbidden impulses surface without repercussions. A wife might steal a kiss from a younger gentleman without reproach. A lord could pursue someone beneath his social rank. The peephole granted permission to abandon their identities, if only momentarily. These social events were typically remembered as quirky yet harmless diversions. Still, they harboured genuine dangers. Envy would sometimes erupt, gossip would begin, household staff would murmur among themselves. Certain kisses lingered in memory. An inappropriate pairing might result in morning awkwardness, or even worse, a public dispute. When hosts became too lenient, these activities would intensify. Alternative versions replaced the peephole with drapes or partitions, creating broader opportunities for contact while reducing personal responsibility. Unlike today's party activities, which tend to be awkward but transparent, these Victorian amusements carried layers of significance and danger. Each caress was deliberately accidental. Every chuckle held hidden meaning, and each participant had to maintain the pretense of mere recreation even when deeper feelings were involved. It resembled theatrical performance, with everyone serving as both performer and spectator. Certain hosts pushed these concepts further. They introduced costumes, musical accompaniment, or beverages containing stronger alcohol than customary. Participants might receive character assignments, instructed to embrace an unknown royal or a dormant princess. The guidelines became unclear and the limits grew flexible. What started as entertainment frequently exposed underlying currents. The wish to experience affection without obligation, the yearning to feel desired without vulnerability. The vocabulary surrounding these occasions was deliberately crafted. Invitations never mentioned kissing directly. They suggested playful interludes or mysterious encounters. Publications avoided direct coverage, though society pages often contained subtle allusions. Lady USA's Wednesday social gathering ended with celebration. Beyond the parlour entrance, a single phrase might convey everything. Those who needed to comprehend already understood. For women, these activities provided an unusual form of independence. They could kiss without making the first move, blush without admitting feelings, flirt without facing consequences. Yet this liberty came with restrictions. If a woman displayed excessive eagerness, she risked being considered improper. If she declined participation, she appeared distant. The principles of propriety didn't disappear. They merely bent temporarily when the blindfolds were secured. What strikes me most profoundly is how Victorian culture used recreation to explore what it feared to acknowledge openly. These diversions weren't coincidental. They were frameworks designed to allow passion to seep through fractures in a barrier built for restraint. Every kiss through a peephole represented defiance, masked as entertainment. Several of the era's most infamous controversies originated at such gatherings. One party, recalled decades afterward in personal accounts, featured a guest identifying his sister's voice from the opposite side of the entrance. Another concluded with a duel when two gentlemen discovered they had both embraced the same married woman. These incidents weren't frequent, but they were memorable, and the tales circulated quietly between estates, invariably concluding with warnings. Know your kissing partner. Better still, don't inquire. Despite potential complications, these games remained popular for years. They provided something the broader Victorian existence denied: contact without accountability, thrill without admission, a kiss without identity. In a society where even dancing required regulations, this represented a form of freedom. As the flames dimmed and merriment dissolved into whispers, a gentleman might press his mouth to a peephole, wondering whose breath met his own. A lady might step away, face flushed, pretending indifference. The activity would conclude, the space would fall silent. The following morning, tea would be served as though nothing had occurred. Soon we encounter the instruments of monitoring and purity. where fathers possessed keys to metal restraints and innovation merged with morality in securing the female form against perceived dangers. As propriety's boundaries constricted and Victorian England's moral expectations penetrated deeper into personal existence, it became inevitable that the body itself would become mechanised. The dread of temptation, already embedded in religious teachings, behavioural guides, and medical theories, began assuming physical form. Among the most disturbing examples was the resurrection of a medieval concept now made sleeker and more effective. The chastity device returned not as legend, but as merchandise. This time, it featured a padlock. While historians continue debating the chastity device's origins, what matters in the Victorian context isn't its source, but its reimagining. The Industrial Revolution didn't just transform transportation or labour practices, it transformed methods of control. Metal, leather, hinges and locks were no longer confined to jails. They were adapted for personal restraint. The target, once more, was the young female form. During the 19th century, chastity mechanisms reappeared in medical catalogues, wellness manuals, and private advertisements. They were no longer elaborate iron contraptions with frightening spikes. Instead, they took the shape of flat metal restraints, sometimes cushioned, lined with cotton or leather, designed for concealment under garments. These restraints covered the pelvis, occasionally with openings for sanitation, but consistently with locks that required another person's key. That person was typically the father. It requires remarkable arrogance for a man to claim he trusts his daughter while keeping the sole key to her undergarments. The rationalization remained constant. Protection. These restraints, fathers argued, would prevent self-gratification, discourage assault, and guarantee purity until matrimony. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay a deeper motivation, the desire to control not merely the body, but the consciousness within it. Most devices weren't sold publicly. They were ordered through coded correspondence with vague descriptions like preventative garment or disciplinary support. Some were crafted by metal workers. Others originated from small facilities specialising in orthopaedic equipment. They weren't mass-produced, but weren't rare enough to survive in museum collections and estate records to suggest the practice exceeded theoretical discussion. The restraints varied in construction. Some were simple straps encircling the waist and passing between the legs. Others included locking systems at the hips or front. A few featured additional elements such as bells that chimed when the wearer attempted removal. Others were lined with small, dull spikes intended to discourage pressure. The objective wasn't merely prevention, it was deterrence through discomfort. These restraints weren't worn willingly, they were imposed. A daughter might be fitted by her mother or governess, then examined daily to ensure the device remained secure. The key, often held by the father, symbolised more than security. It represented ownership. Compared to modern concepts of bodily autonomy, the image of a young girl wearing a locked metal restraint while her father carried the key in his vest pocket is absolutely horrifying. For some families, the restraint became part of a broader system, alongside locked sleeves at night, rigid schedules, and limited exposure to boys. The restraint completed a circle of prevention. It wasn't viewed as cruelty, it was considered care. A responsible father protected his daughter even from herself. A good daughter didn't object. She endured. When the restraint was used outside the home, situations became more complex. Boarding schools occasionally received girls already wearing the device, accompanied by parental letters with management instructions. Teachers or nurses were directed to supervise hygiene, unlock the restraint for bathing, then secure it again. The girls involved often remained silent. Silence, they had learned, was part of being virtuous. What strikes me most is how technological advancement was employed not to liberate, but to reinvent control. In a world beginning to invent bicycles, typewriters, and electric lighting, someone also invented an improved method to ensure a girl couldn't touch herself. Progress advanced in every field except trust. Some medical professionals endorsed the practice, particularly those concerned with the alleged epidemic of masturbation. They warned that young girls who touched themselves would suffer nervous breakdown, facial blemishes, and even sterility. The restraint was presented as medical intervention, not moral hysteria, but preventive treatment. Families who could afford them ordered custom fittings. Girls who resisted were scolded, restrained, or shamed. In today's era of health education and personal rights, the Victorian chastity restraint appears more like punishment than precaution. But, in its time, it was described in terms of virtue, hygiene, and peace of mind. Parents who used it often believed they were acting correctly. They mistook silence for safety and discomfort for discipline. Despite their efforts, some girls found resistance methods. They learned lockpicking, filing down edges, or loosening straps without detection. A few wrote coded diary entries documenting their frustration, pain, or anger. Others remained quiet, allowing the restraint to shape not just their bodies, but their understanding of intimacy. Some reached adulthood, never having seen themselves in a mirror without metal interference. The restraint did more than prevent physical acts. It conveyed that the body was untrustworthy, that pleasure was shameful, that control belonged to others. Even after removal, that message persisted. It lingered in how a woman moved, reacted to touch, viewed herself. What resonates most is the sound a key must have made, turning, unlocking not just a device, but an entire belief system that virtue required confinement, that female desire needed containment, that silence, once again, was morality's highest form. As night settled over quiet homes and fathers checked their timepieces, a girl might lie in bed with cool metal pressing against her skin. She didn't dream, or if she did, she wouldn't admit it. The key remained on the mantel shelf between the family Bible and the household ledger. Now we discover another strange cabinet of invention where powders promise to reshape the body, fragrances aim to eliminate natural scents, and advertisements offered transformation at the expense of safety. Victorian beauty, it appears, wasn't always superficial. Sometimes it was toxic. In an era obsessed with control, modesty, and moral surveillance, the female body in Victorian England was still expected to perform, not in terms of overt sexuality, but through silent, visible signals that aligned with femininity's ideal. A woman was supposed to appear delicate, smell pleasant, and seem effortlessly composed constantly. If she didn't, the problem was hers to solve. By the late 19th century, the expanding cosmetics and pharmaceutical industries were eager to assist. Magazines, medical pamphlets, and discreet catalogues began offering products promising to enhance a woman's appeal. These weren't labelled seduction tools. They were framed as self-improvement, hygiene, or marital obligation. A fading complexion might be blamed for a husband's indifference. A natural scent, if too strong, might suggest poor character. Breasts that remained small after adolescence could indicate underdeveloped womanhood. Every curve, smell, and shadow became an intervention point. Among the most bizarre products were those claiming to enlarge the breast. Some appeared as herbal tonics, others as topical creams or pills. These remedies promised to restore fullness, roundness, or firmness, sometimes within a week. The advertising language was always coded. Terms like restore youthful contour or enhance natural elegance appeared in soft fonts beside sketches of idealized silhouettes. But the message was clear. It takes particular cruelty to convince a woman her worth depends on achieving a body nature never provided her. Then sell her poison to help her attempt it. Many alleged breast enhancement formulas contained dangerous ingredients. Arsenic, mercury, and lead were common. Some tonics relied on strong stimulants to increase blood flow, creating temporary swelling marketed as success. Others caused rashes, dizziness, or internal damage. But risk was overshadowed by promise. These products weren't only sold in questionable corners. Some were endorsed by prominent physicians or carried royal approval seals. Shops in London's most respectable districts stocked them, tucked behind counters and handed over with hushed voices. Women from all social classes became customers. The poor might save for weeks to buy a single bottle. The wealthy might keep several on their vanity, alongside perfume, powder, and hair tonic. Perfume, too, became a battleground, but not in the modern sense of luxury and choice. Victorian perfume wasn't about identity, it was about concealment. Women were expected to cover their body's natural scent, particularly the lower regions. Advertisements for intimate fragrance powders and floral dressing mists appeared with increasing frequency in the century's final decades. These products were sprinkled on undergarments or sprayed into skirt folds. They carried names like Rosewater Purity or Blossom Grace. Compared to today's world of body positivity and skincare transparency, Victorian self-care often resembled a quiet war against one's biology. A woman didn't apply powder to feel beautiful. She applied it to avoid disgust, prevent gossip, keep her husband from turning away. Cleanliness wasn't enough. She had to smell like someone who didn't sweat, bleed, or age. The worst part is that many fragrances were laced with chemicals causing more harm than help. Some contained formaldehyde or alcohols that irritated skin. Others included heavy metals used to stabilize scent compounds. Women reported itching, burning, and sometimes infections. But they continued using them because not using them risked more than discomfort. It risked judgment. What fascinates me is how these products weren't seen as indulgences. They were responsibilities. A good wife kept herself presentable. A good mother taught her daughters the same. Vanity was discouraged, maintenance was expected, and the line between the two was never clearly defined. What stays with me is how women were told to fix themselves using substances that broke them. They were instructed to smell like flowers while slowly poisoning their skin, to glow with health while swallowing tonics that darkened gums, all under the pretense of staying desirable to men who were never asked to do the same. Some women resisted. They wrote letters to publications questioning these products' safety. A few early feminists pointed out the contradiction of being valued for appearance and blamed for vanity. Others shared homemade remedies using herbs or oils considered safer. But commercial pressure remained strong, and the fear of losing beauty or being seen as unclean was stronger still. This pressure didn't operate in isolation. It worked alongside everything else Victorian women endured. The virginity tests, the chastity restraints, the wedding night inspections. Together, they created a system where a woman's body was not only watched, but constantly re-engineered. She was expected to alter it, manage it, restrain it, and conceal it. There was no space for natural variation, only a narrow standard that shifted slightly each decade. In middle-class homes, young girls learned these lessons early. They watched their mothers apply powders in the morning and tonics at night. They read about feminine refinement in books left on parlour tables. They heard their fathers compliment or criticise based on scent and softness. When old enough, they too were expected to participate, to purchase, to apply, to smile. For many, it became a daily ritual. Powder in the undergarments, tonic before dressing, a dab of scent behind each ear. These acts, repeated quietly in private spaces, became symbols of discipline. They weren't about feeling good. They were about staying acceptable, staying married, staying chosen. As the sun faded over quiet neighbourhoods and the streets fell silent, a woman might stand before her mirror, dabbing her wrists with rose water and checking her neckline for discoloration. On her dresser sat a small tin marked feminine tonic. The ingredients were unreadable. The promise was unmistakable. She had done everything right. Whether it made her feel whole was never the question. Now, we examine how expression itself became criminal, not through touch, but through words. Poetry, letters, and art that dared mention desire were censored, seized, and turned into evidence of moral decay. Because in Victorian England, even your thoughts could betray you. After locking the body and medicating the senses, Victorian society turned its attention to control's final frontier, thought. It wasn't enough to monitor behaviour, scent, and silence. Now even words written in ink, whispered in verse, hidden between poem lines, were subject to moral investigation. In a world where intimacy was already policed in bedrooms and bathrooms, the imagination itself became a legal risk. Poetry, a form long associated with beauty and truth, became a battleground not because of violence or obscenity in the modern sense, but because of what it implied. A single line suggesting longing, a metaphor hinting at the body, a verse lingering too long on lips, skin, or breath. These could be interpreted as dangerous. Erotic suggestion, even when disguised as romantic symbolism, was viewed with suspicion. Publishers, editors, and readers all knew the unspoken boundaries. To cross them was to risk everything. The law reflected this fear. Under the Obscene Publications Act and other moral regulations of the time, literature deemed to corrupt public morals could be banned, confiscated, or used as evidence in court. This included novels, letters, drawings, and most famously poetry. A poem didn't have to describe sex explicitly. It only had to imply desire in ways considered inappropriate. Desire that stepped outside marital duty. Desire that was same-sex, female-driven, or expressed too boldly. It takes a deeply repressed culture to read a line about flowers blooming and accuse the author of moral collapse. But that's exactly what happened. Poems with gentle allusions to passion were labelled indecent. Writers were arrested, publishers fined, booksellers warned. Behind each case was the fear that the written word could stir something uncontrollable in the reader. The most tragic symbol of this fear was Oscar Wilde, a man of immense wit, literary talent, and unapologetic elegance. Wilde was not just punished for his relationships, but for his writing. His plays and essays contained veiled references to love between men. His letters, particularly those to Lord Alfred Douglas, revealed affection in poetry lines that were tender, coded, and emotional. When he was prosecuted, these texts became central to the case. They were read aloud in court as evidence of depravity. Wilde's conviction for gross indecency was not only a personal downfall, it was a warning to others, a reminder that words, however beautiful, could be weaponized. Compared to today, where erotic literature flourishes openly across genres and platforms, the idea that a letter could send someone to prison seems absurd. But in Wilde's time, the state considered such letters subversive. They blurred the line between personal freedom and public threat. Even private correspondence wasn't safe. Love letters, if discovered, could be used against their authors. This applied not only to same-sex relationships, but to heterosexual ones as well. A married man receiving an overly affectionate note from another woman could be accused of adultery. A woman who expressed sexual longing in her writing could be declared unfit for marriage. The letters were read out of context, stripped of tone and trust, until they served a narrative of shame. Writers, aware of this danger, adapted. They used symbolism. They buried meaning in allegory. They described physical longing through nature, seas, winds, storms, fire. But censors became skilled readers of metaphor. They dissected lines, questioned intent, and judged entire works based on a few suggestive phrases. A novel might be banned because of a single chapter. A poem was seized because of one ambiguous stanza. What fascinates me most is how the tools meant for beauty, pens, paper, verse, were turned into instruments of surveillance. The very act of writing became risky, not because of what was done, but because of what might be felt, It created a culture where artists second-guessed every word, not for clarity or elegance, but for safety. This paranoia wasn't limited to elites. Working-class writers, female poets, and even teenagers found themselves scrutinized. Diaries were searched, school compositions examined. In one case, a girl's journal discovered by her mother led to the girl being institutionalized for moral instability. She had written about kissing a friend. That was enough. Bookstores developed subtle systems to handle sensitive material. Some placed certain volumes behind the counter. Others created members-only clubs that offered restricted access to banned or controversial works. Publishers sometimes released small private editions of poems deemed too risky for the general public. These were sold at high prices to collectors and hidden in personal libraries behind false book spines. Still, the desire for expression did not vanish. Writers continued to test the limits. Some used anonymity or pseudonyms. Others wrote letters in code or entrusted their most intimate work to trusted friends. A few escaped to other countries, hoping for more literary freedom. Their courage preserved a tradition of honest writing that future generations would reclaim. This climate of suspicion shaped not only what was written but how people read. Readers became cautious. They looked over their shoulders. They skipped certain passages or marked them out. They learned to read subtext deeply, recognizing longing where it was only whispered. For some, these acts of reading became as intimate as the poems themselves. In today's world, where personal writing is protected and free speech widely defended, the Victorian fear of poetry seems almost theatrical. Yet, it was genuine. It demanded people's identities, their liberty, and sometimes their very existence. The terror wasn't about corruption, but about sensing that a single phrase might awaken something the reader couldn't contain. So, quietude became the choice. As darkness fell over hushed libraries and study tables, a gentleman might sit solitary under lamp glow, tucking a correspondence delicately into a compartment. The message had been crafted with precision, verses of yearning wrapped in symbolism, yet still clear. He understood they could never reach their destination. He would destroy them eventually, though not tonight. Moving forward, we'll shift from language back to steel and cloth, where forms were confined not merely by statute or document, but by frigid restraint. Concealed under garments, under reserved expressions, the feminine figure was secured by a belt bearing a lock with a single key. Long before any woman entered a white gown to speak her promises, her form had been evaluated not by her chosen partner, but by custom, not through dialogue, but through assumption. In Victorian Britain, purity wasn't merely a concept, it was an examination. That examination, unjust and unreliable, drove some women towards silent, agonizing choices. In shadowed areas of private facilities, behind entrances no one mentioned, existed one final opportunity to recover what society declared should never be missing. The method was straightforward in careful theory, savage in practice. A woman who worried her membrane might be damaged could arrange to have it sewn back into place. The operation had no official designation. It carried no formal medical label, yet its intention was clear. Several swift movements with needle and string would fabricate the appearance of an unbroken barrier. This reconstructed membrane wasn't meant to endure indefinitely. Only sufficient time to bleed once more. Just enough duration to satisfy a sheet and an inspection. These operations weren't performed in contemporary hospitals. They occurred in dimly lit back chambers, managed by midwives, former nurses, or physicians who had mastered keeping their judgments private. The instruments were elementary: a needle, some thread, a cloth. No pain relief, no sanitization, sometimes not even a sterile surface. The woman would recline, knees separated, fingers gripped tight. It concluded rapidly, though not painlessly. It requires a culture deeply fixated on the notion of feminine innocence to devise a surgery not for wellness, but for trickery. Still, for countless women, no alternative existed. Whether they had participated in willing intimacy, suffered violation, or simply feared their anatomy wouldn't meet standards. The demand was to demonstrate you remain untouched or face rejection. Often these operations were quietly organised by mothers, sisters, or trusted companions. The meeting would be whispered about, never documented. Compensation was provided in currency or services. No records were maintained. Some providers even agreed to supply a signed statement declaring the woman had received minor gynecological treatment for health purposes. It wasn't legal proof, but frequently satisfied a doubting spouse or worried mother-in-law. The existence of this document established a second level of deception. Now there existed not only a stitched barrier, but also documentation to accompany it. Some women brought the certificate to their wedding evening. Others stored it in drawers or asked a reliable friend to keep it. It wasn't displayed with pride. It was preserved against possible accusations. Against today's comprehension of personal autonomy, this clandestine surgery appears like a desperate effort to satisfy impossible demands. Yet the disgrace didn't rest on those who required the evidence. It landed on the women who had to supply it. The agony, the danger of contamination, and the afterward silence were all viewed as a minor cost for being trusted. The surgery itself differed based on who conducted it. Some employed medical suture, others depended on regular sewing threads soaked in spirits. The stitching was typically minimal, designed only to establish a thin barrier that would rupture during relations. Contamination was frequent, scarring more common still. Yet most women never returned for additional care. Once completed, they proceeded ahead and hoped for success. Some endured the operation multiple times. A stitch might break prematurely or dissolve before the wedding evening. A second appointment would be scheduled, often with greater nervousness. In unusual instances, women were sewn excessively tight, causing intense pain or excessive bleeding during intimacy. Yet these results weren't openly discussed. Nobody inquired, nobody wished to learn what it felt like. The husbands typically never discovered. They anticipated blood and found it. That sufficed. They didn't question the origin or the technique. They didn't ask why a woman might shake more than expected or pull back when caressed. The illusion remained whole, and so did their honour. What strikes me deeply is that these women weren't attempting to mislead from malice. They were trying to survive an examination that should never have existed. The stitched membrane wasn't deception. It was protection, a final effort to gain acceptance in a society that mistook anatomy for morality. Some women had done absolutely nothing, yet feared they would fail the test. Perhaps they had tumbled from a horse or ridden a bicycle. Perhaps their membrane had torn from activity or sickness. They sought the surgery not to conceal shame, but to avoid false condemnation. Their innocence remained intact, yet their bodies had betrayed them, or so they had been convinced. Some practitioners recognized this pattern and provided guidance. A few refused to conduct the procedure without clear justification. Others made their living from it. There was need, and wherever need exists, quiet provision follows. These surgeries were seldom documented. Medical publications didn't address them. Public health authorities overlooked them. Yet they persisted repeatedly behind curtains in cities and villages throughout the nation. One stitch at a time, women sewed themselves back into the story of respectability. As they departed the clinic, they didn't walk prouder. They walked more carefully. They wore silence like additional skin. For them, the price wasn't only physical, it was emotional. It was understanding that their bodies had been modified, not for their own benefit, but for another's expectation. As sunset arrived, on cobblestone streets and drapes were pulled across sitting room windows, a bride might stand at her looking glass, touching the rim of her bodice, breathing deliberately. She had accomplished what was necessary. The pain had subsided. The fear remained. Yet tomorrow would arrive, and with it an examination she had prepared for in ways no one would ever be permitted to acknowledge. Moving ahead, we'll conclude this section with the ultimate teaching. Victorian women learned that longing was hazardous, that romance was a trial, that silence meant security, and that in a world constructed on appearances, the body was never truly theirs from the start. Following hymen stitching and silencing poetry, Victorian propriety focused on the wardrobe. Not for attractiveness, not even for decency as we comprehend it now, but for limitation. What a woman wore wasn't simply about style or social standing. It concerned control. Her undergarments became her borders, and in a strange development, the more revealed her body appeared under certain materials, the more safeguarded her virtue was thought to be. Initially, the reasoning seemed backwards. Transparent nightgowns made of lace or gauze were labelled appropriate. Corsets, so constricting they created bruises, were celebrated for their discipline. Layered underskirts could be see-through in daylight. Yet nobody questioned their function. These garments weren't meant to entice. They were crafted to ensnare. A woman might be covered from throat to feet, yet so tightly restricted or thinly covered that she remained completely inaccessible. The corset specifically wasn't just a shaping device. It was a system of bodily regulation. Fastened tightly at the rear, often by someone else, it squeezed the waist, elevated the chest and paralyzed the torso. Beyond shaping, it served another function. It limited movement. A woman in a corset couldn't bend naturally. She couldn't reach easily beneath her waist. Self-touching became physically impossible. It requires a particular type of genius to market physical immobility as grace and suffering as evidence of moral excellence. Victorian women were commended for their delicate movements, their straight bearing and their modest appetites. Yet behind that praise existed a structure that kept their bodies stiff and compliant. The corset wasn't merely clothing. It was a reminder that even the space between a woman and her flesh could belong to someone else. These limitations continued into nighttime. One might assume that after the day's layers were shed, the body would be liberated. Yet even rest provided no freedom. Nightwear followed the same contradiction. Lace-decorated chemises transparent enough to show skin and form were deemed suitable not because they encouraged desire, but because they displayed a lack of availability. A husband could observe, but the woman herself couldn't reach. That was the boundary. Sometimes, sleepwear included built-in restrictions. Sleeves were sewn in ways that made raising arms challenging. Drawstrings at the bottom prevented skirts from lifting too high. Some nightgowns were even fastened at the rear, requiring help to remove. All of this supported the same belief that restraint created virtue, that limitation preserved purity. Compared to contemporary concepts of comfortable lingerie or empowering fashion, Victorian undergarments frequently resembled gentle prisons. They were beautiful, sometimes lavishly so, yet that beauty concealed their actual purpose. To prevent, to restrict, to contain. This reasoning extended into etiquette language. A woman who dressed herself was deemed independent but somewhat questionable. A woman who needed assistance dressing and undressing was considered modest. The inability to access her own form became a virtue, and any garment that made this more challenging was praised. Mothers transmitted these standards to their daughters. Young girls were introduced to corsets as early as adolescence. The first was often presented as a milestone like a confirmation or birthday celebration. It was measured, fitted and adjusted carefully. The girl would grimace, then stand straighter. She had joined the ranks of the respectable. Her body, now partially beyond reach, was considered prepared for society. Servants performed a quiet function in this system. They laced, fastened and unfastened. They witnessed the red marks left on ribs, the swelling of compressed organs, and the fainting episodes caused by restricted breathing. Yet they said little. They were trained to consider these signs normal, even desirable. A woman who fainted was deemed delicate. A woman who wore her corset through pregnancy was praised for discipline. There were exceptions, naturally. Some women rebelled, loosening their stays when unobserved. Others selected softer materials or simpler designs. A few joined early movements for clothing reform, arguing that freedom of movement wasn't immodest. Yet these voices were uncommon. Most women, even those who despised the feeling of whalebone against their flesh, accepted the rules because they understood what was threatened. What captivates me is how this entire structure relied on the illusion that restriction meant safety, that denying access to others and to oneself was the secret to dignity. Once this concept took hold, it influenced every detail of how a woman prepared herself daily. The effects went beyond discomfort. Extended corset use caused rib deformities, digestive problems and breathing difficulties. Skin beneath the stays often developed sores or bruises. Yet doctors, fashion authorities and husbands continued endorsing the practice. They emphasized posture, not pain, on poise, not pressure. The peculiar logic of sheer sleepwear followed the same path. It was intended to signal purity through exposed revelation that showed without offering. A thin cotton gown, nearly transparent in candlelight, wasn't considered indecent because it accompanied a locked bedroom door, a husband's permission and the silence of obedience. A woman who wore it couldn't reach herself. That was sufficient to make it modest. This established a culture where women were expected to appear untouched and remain unreachable. Even their curiosity was deemed threatening. The layers of lace, the tighteners of bone and thread, the reverse fastenings, all combined into a system that made the body both visible and untouchable. As another peaceful evening settled in, a young wife might sit at her dressing table, fingers numb from the day's compression, breath shallow, skin still marked beneath her corset. Her servant folded the nightgown, thin as a whisper, and arranged it on the bed. The mirror reflected a body wrapped in discipline, not desire. She was dressed for sleep, yet never for rest. Moving forward, we'll close the account with one final section. A lesson drawn from pain, from silence, and a history of secrets sewn into hidden seams. Because ultimately, Victorian modesty wasn't about virtue. It was about power. And those who wore it carried the heaviest burden. As Victorian ideals of purity and restraint controlled the lives of women in parlours and bedrooms, another world existed just beyond the view. In hospitals, especially those connected with the military, standards were influenced by different forces. Necessity, pain, injury and trauma forced the body into situations that society preferred not to contemplate. For men who returned from conflict broken in ways not easily seen, assistance sometimes arrived in forms that could never be publicly recognized. Among the strangest and most disturbing rumours that survived the period is one about nurses and a responsibility that was never recorded in guidelines. The Victorian military emphasised strength and masculinity heavily. A soldier's identity was founded on discipline, loyalty and endurance. Yet what occurred when the body failed to satisfy those expectations? Among the most dreaded consequences of battlefield trauma was testicular injury. The loss of sexual capability was more than a physical defeat. It represented a loss of manhood, a crack in the identity that the military had so carefully built. In such situations, soldiers weren't always sent home. Some remained in extended care wards surrounded by the ticking of clocks, the rustling of bed sheets, and the quiet hum of unmentionable needs. Official documents describe their conditions in medical terms: swelling, loss of function, hormonal disruptions. Yet between the lines of these medical files, stories spread that pointed to something different, a type of treatment offered not with medication but with hands. The accounts were never documented by the institutions. They appear in letters, in memoirs and in whispers shared from one veteran to another. A soldier might say he had been cared for in a way that helped restore his dignity. The suggestion was in some hospitals, certain nurses were quietly expected to help paralysed or injured men reach release, not for pleasure, not for desire, but for duty. It requires a special kind of moral gymnastics to condemn women for expressing desire while quietly assigning them to fulfill someone else's in silence. These nurses weren't trained for this responsibility. It wasn't discussed in medical school or formal instruction. It was simply expected in some places, a silent extension of care, a gesture toward helping a man feel whole again. In most cases, the patient was described as suffering from retained fluids or congestive imbalance. The vocabulary was unclear, intentionally so. Doctors rarely documented the treatments, and when they did, they used euphemisms. Manual intervention might be recorded, or peripheral circulatory stimulation, yet what occurred in these curtained corners didn't resemble standard care. The nurses, often young women assigned to male wards, were given quiet instructions. Not all complied. Some objected and were reassigned. Others felt trapped between their duty to the hospital and their discomfort. A few rationalised the act as part of healing. They believed that by helping these men they were providing something important. Not sexuality, but restoration, the ability to feel like a man again, even briefly. Compared to modern ethical standards in medical care, the idea that physical relief was once considered a nurse's obligation is deeply troubling. Yet in the Victorian context, where women's boundaries were often defined by others, it fits into a broader pattern. Women were expected to care, to serve, to ease suffering, without question, whether in homes, in marriages, or on the battlefield. Their role was to absorb discomfort, never to speak of their own. The soldiers themselves often treated the experience with a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. In some memoirs, men described feeling ashamed of their body's response. Others expressed deep appreciation not for the act, but for the sense of normalcy it gave them. In those moments, they felt seen not as patients, but as men. The women who provided this relief were rarely named. They remained figures in the background, quiet, efficient, forgettable. Hospitals didn't advertise or endorse this practice. Officially, it didn't exist, yet the silence around it was part of what made it so enduring. The absence of documentation protected institutions, but also erased the emotional toll. These women had no forums to speak in, no language to explain. They were expected to forget what they did, just as they were told to forget what they wanted. Some historians argue that these practices were rare, confined to certain military hospitals under extreme circumstances. Others believe they were more widespread but deliberately hidden. The lack of records makes it difficult to say. What we have are fragments, journal entries, hushed recollections, a recurring pattern of women placed in intimate proximity to power with no power of their own. What fascinates me is how the same society that preached chastity and self-denial turned to women in private to resolve male discomfort. There was no contradiction as long as no one spoke of it. Morality was for the public sphere. Behind hospital walls, morality made room for practicality. Pain needed to be relieved, hormones needed to be balanced. And if a woman's body or hand could accomplish that, it was simply part of the job. What stays with me is the silence. These nurses must have carried their task unspoken, their service unrecorded. They didn't receive medals or promotions, only nods, only quiet instructions, and perhaps the uneasy awareness that their care extended far beyond bandages and thermometers. As the gas lights dimmed across hospital corridors and the smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, a nurse might wash her hands at a basin, staring into the cracked mirror above it. The patient had fallen asleep. The chart remained blank. Outside, boots passed along stone floors. Inside, she folded a towel and placed it beside the bed, then walked away. Moving ahead, we'll return to the civilian world, where young girls were punished not for what they did, but for how they walked, laughed or dressed. Because in Victorian England, even the shape of a footstep could be considered a threat to virtue. Even in a society saturated with regulations, where poems were censored, corsets were weaponised, and silence was the measure of grace, Victorian morality still found new corners to regulate. Marriage, supposedly the sanctuary where physical intimacy was finally allowed, came with its own set of complications. Desire remained suspect, passion was seen as primitive, And even in the sacred space of the marriage bed, some sought to eliminate what little closeness was permitted. The solution, as always, was restraint. This time it arrived not as fabric or posture, but as furniture. Some households, especially among the devout or the aristocratic, began using what they called therapeutic or moral beds. These were not designed for health in the modern sense. They were designed to ensure that marital intercourse took place without physical intimacy. The body could fulfill its role. The soul, they hoped, would remain untouched. These beds, or contraptions, often took the form of divided mattresses or wooden frames. In some versions, the couple lay side by side, separated by a thick wooden partition. Only a single, carefully measured hole connected the two halves. It was just large enough to permit the necessary physical act for conception. Touching, embracing, kissing, or even facing one another was made impossible by the design. It takes an extraordinary fear of human closeness to build a piece of furniture whose entire purpose is to prevent bodies from touching during intimacy. Yet this was not considered strange at the time. It was seen as dignified, elevated, a way to carry out the duties of marriage without falling into the sin of enjoyment. The thinking behind this arrangement came from a blend of religious asceticism and emerging ideas about hygiene. Some theologians preach that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, corrupted the purity of intention. Others warned that too much bodily contact led to disease or emotional weakness. The solution for those who believed in both ideas was mechanical separation. Historical accounts reveal that certain religious communities and wealthy families consumed with maintaining moral purity employed unusual sleeping arrangements. The word therapeutic was frequently used not for any health advantages, but because these setups were believed to safeguard psychological and spiritual wellness. A husband and wife could meet their duty to procreate while avoiding the corrupting effects of physical desire. Most of these contraptions were specially constructed. A woodworker might be commissioned to build a wooden barrier or separator with exact specifications. The central hole would be strengthened with cloth or sometimes metal bands to avoid splinters or harm. Certain designs featured restraints to ensure immobility. Others contained locking sections to eliminate any unauthorized motion. These were documented realities. Existing drawings and written accounts verify their usage, though they remained uncommon. Compared to modern conversations about intimacy, connection and consent, the concept of a non-contact marital apparatus seems more like mockery than custom. Yet for some Victorians, this approach was considered perfect. It eliminated the complications of feeling. It minimized the danger of passion. It permitted conception without intimacy, and by doing so, it matched perfectly with the cultural fixation on restraint. Women possessed little voice in this setup. They were instructed that genuine virtue demanded they yield without emotion. Their purpose was to bear children, not to feel satisfaction. Within this framework, the apparatus helped strengthen the lesson. A wife who remained rigid and silent behind a partition could not be blamed for temptation. A husband who fulfilled the act without caressing her face could not be accused of losing his self-control. Some women appreciated the separation, particularly those who dreaded intimacy or who had learned that enjoyment was disgraceful. Others bore it quietly, bewildered and yearning for something more compassionate. The apparatus permitted the deed to happen without eye contact, without shared breath, without hands on flesh. It represented a complete rejection of the physical in service of duty. Not every household employed such beds, but even in homes without physical obstacles, the same philosophy dominated. Couples were frequently instructed to avoid gazing at each other during relations, to utter no sounds, to consider only obligation. Various guides directed wives to remain motionless and pray silently during the encounter. The focus was not on bonding, but on tolerance. These convictions were supported by religious leaders, physicians, and social authorities. Literature cautioned that emotional attachment created dependency, that desire weakened resolve, that excessive touching would destroy discipline. The perfect couple, they claimed, was reserved, pure, detached, and these peculiar devices became the physical manifestation of that philosophy. What haunts me is the vision of two individuals connected only by a piece of timber, performing humanity's most primal act as though they were unknown to each other, their faces concealed, their limbs unable to touch, their words unspoken. They were wed by statute, united by religion, yet separated by terror. Few of these contraptions endured. Most were taken apart, concealed or demolished when the family moved forward. Some were converted into storage chests or sleeping quarters for staff. But their reality remains documented in autobiographies, correspondence, and private collections of domestic blueprints. They existed among items never intended for public view, only for use, only recalled with unease. Some physicians eventually opposed them, claiming that suppressing intimacy caused mental disturbances. Others proposed that the absence of affection bred emotional distance in families, but their opinions were limited and easily overwhelmed by teachings on virtue and decency. The conviction stayed strong in many areas that separation meant security and closeness meant danger. As oil flames danced across decorated bedrooms and silhouettes shifted on plaster, a wife might rest on her portion of the bed, her sleeping gown arranged, her palms clasped over her chest. Her husband would recline nearby, divided by a barrier of smooth wood. They would exchange no conversation. Only one brief interaction would occur through the gap between them. Then, quiet returned. The Victorian fixation with righteousness reached further into domestic existence, extending beyond controlling adult conduct. It focused its attention on society's youngest members. Young girls, just approaching adolescence, became subjects of a culture that feared their natural progression. Puberty was viewed not as a biological phase, but as a warning sign of spiritual or moral corruption. So families didn't simply watch over their daughters. They examined them. When a girl appeared too inquisitive, too conscious, or simply too advanced in her development, parents sought guidance from a respected source, the medical establishment. Doctors of that time were not impartial observers. They were expected to function as moral guardians alongside their healing duties. A girl who started developing physically or menstruating earlier than deemed appropriate could be diagnosed as problematic, abnormal, or even consumed by dangerous impulses. Parents, especially mothers, feared their daughters were being overwhelmed by what was termed premature sexuality. In certain households, simply being a cheerful, active, or body-curious girl was sufficient cause for concern. She would be brought, often privately, to the family physician. These appointments were not presented as discipline, but as medical requirements. A girl too young to comprehend would be examined under the guise of protection. Her form would be measured, her body explored, and her behaviour assessed. The objective was not merely diagnosis, but modification. Allegedly, these girls were receiving treatment for the hazards of their urges. Nothing demonstrates the blurred line between care and domination quite like bringing a child to a doctor to have her instincts modified. Yet such visits were tolerated, even promoted. Physicians published research about the phenomenon of premature female arousal, describing it in professional yet clearly disapproving language. A girl who fantasized or showed embarrassment was suspicious. One who explored herself or posed questions could be recommended for what they termed therapeutic treatment. The interventions differed. Some doctors suggested cold immersion or restricted nutrition. Others administered electrical shocks to nerve centers to diminish what they characterized as overstimulation. In severe instances, girls endured genital burning, surgical procedures, or forced seclusion. These techniques were regarded not as abuse, but as moral remedies. Suffering was expected, humiliation was integral. Picture informing a child that her bodily sensations are hazardous and must be eliminated like a disease. That was the experience for some young girls within this framework. They were not educated about their anatomy. They were taught to distrust it, to view their maturation as danger, to associate growing older with becoming impure. These concepts did not preserve innocence. They redefined it as ignorance and muteness. Many involved doctors believed they were acting righteously. Victorian medicine was thoroughly connected with religious principles. The female form was considered naturally susceptible to instability, hysteria, or temptation. A girl who developed early might corrupt others. Therefore, treatment also served to eliminate a perceived social threat, but some exploited the situation. In certain dark areas of the system, medical examinations provided opportunities for abuse. Under the pretext of assessment, girls were handled, restrained, or subjected to degrading procedures. Their protests were dismissed. Their distress was ignored because when the doctor declared it necessary, questioning was forbidden, especially from the patient. Historical documentation of such cases exists buried in margins or stored in legal records. Most were never pursued. The victims were too young to speak with credibility. Their families were too embarrassed to acknowledge what occurred. And society was too invested in believing everything was done for proper reasons. Even today, it remains challenging to separate the well-meaning from the predatory in the aftermath of these treatments. Some doctors later protested the practice. They argued that labeling puberty as sickness created more damage than benefit, but their concerns were frequently dismissed. Others attempted to redirect attention toward education and emotional support. Yet, even those efforts operated within rigid gender assumptions. The prevailing belief persisted. A proper girl was a silent girl, and a silent girl was one whose development had been appropriately monitored. Mothers, meanwhile, lived in constant anxiety about failing. They were told that a daughter's purity measured maternal achievement. If a girl was discovered to be immoral, responsibility would fall on her upbringing. So women became enforcers of silence within their homes. Some trained their daughters to avoid direct gazing. Others prohibited dancing, singing, or laughing with enthusiasm. Any display could be interpreted as proof of misconduct. What struck me most profoundly was how these young girls were treated not as children discovering life, but as women already condemned for something they hadn't committed. Their purity was considered temporary, their growth medicalized, and their faith in adults was gradually destroyed by rituals of suspicion. Eventually, this fear of female development became woven into everything from books to clothing. Girls were dressed in confining garments to delay their physical progress. They were discouraged from reading fiction or attending gatherings where they might witness or hear something improper. Even companionships were supervised. A girl who grew too attached to another girl was sometimes suspected of harboring inappropriate emotions. All of this left wounds, emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical. Some women who matured under these conditions later described nightmares, aversions, and permanent confusion about closeness. Others simply never discussed it at all because the lesson was evident from childhood. Your body belongs to others. It is something to be observed, adjusted, and never trusted. As gaslight flickered in sitting rooms and the final sounds of vehicles disappeared into the mist, a mother might sit beside her daughter's bed, hoping she had done enough, that the doctor had done enough, that no one would ever claim the girl had acted inappropriately. In this peculiar world, safety was measured not by wellness, but by silence. If Victorian society required women to remain quiet about their longings in public, then some responded by documenting those longings in private. Inside vanity tables, behind drapes, or beneath mattress corners, small journals contained secrets that would have scandalized the parlors and church halls of the era. These were not diaries about household tasks or social events. They were written testimonies of inner worlds where women examined the forbidden thoughts they could never voice aloud. In a culture that refused women independence, these personal writings provided a fragile sanctuary for self-discovery. Yet even this private action carried risks. Among wealthy women, especially those with access to learning and solitude, maintaining a journal was typical. What made these journals extraordinary was not their presence, but their substance. During the late Victorian era, an increasing number of women used them to contemplate their physicality, attraction, and yearning. They wrote about sensation, about feelings they sometimes lacked vocabulary for, and about the silent pain of being regarded as invisible entities. Some passages read like personal experiments in self-examination. Others were urgent appeals for comprehension, and some, to contemporary readers, would resemble verse wrapped in guilt. Yet these women were cautious. They understood the stakes. These diaries were not displayed openly on surfaces. They were covered in leather, wrapped in fabric, sometimes secured with small keys or hidden in containers with clasps and fasteners. Some even had specially designed compartments disguised as jewellery boxes or needlework supplies. The concealment was not ornamental, it was protective, because if anyone discovered the contents, the results could be devastating. When your physical being is monitored by society, your thoughts become the final refuge. And even that was threatened. There are records of women being rejected by their families after such journals were found. Others were quietly committed to asylums, labelled as unstable or hysterical. The reasoning was always identical. A respectable woman would not contemplate such matters. She would not record them. She would not even possess the language to express them. So the existence of such writing was treated not as a request for understanding or evidence of intelligence, but as a violation of morality. The truth was more complex. Many women who maintained these diaries were not revolutionaries or troublemakers. They were faithful wives, compliant daughters, or well-behaved young ladies. They followed conventions, at least publicly. But they could not eliminate the aspect of themselves that wondered, desired, or remembered. The diary was where that side of them existed, sometimes for decades, sometimes until their final days. One woman, a nobleman's daughter, maintained a journal where she recorded the dates of her forbidden dreams and the identities of men who featured in them. She never pursued her fantasies. She simply documented them. The notebook was stored under her cold-weather clothing, covered in velvet. When her mother discovered it, the girl was sent to a distant cousin under the excuse of needing country air. She never saw her family home again. That diary, years later, was discovered in an attic container. The lock was damaged, but the words survived. Not all the writing was explicit. Some diaries concentrated on yearning, anxiety, or bewilderment. Women questioned why they experienced things they had never learned about, why their bodies responded during worship or while reading novels. Others lamented the absence of closeness in their marriages or the lack of tenderness from those supposed to cherish them. These were not women attempting to be indecent, they were attempting to be complete. It's difficult not to view these diaries as subtle acts of defiance, even though they never left bedroom drawers. They were written evidence that desire persisted beneath restrictive clothing and social etiquette, that women possessed thoughts not moulded by fathers, husbands, or clergy, and that even in an era obsessed with suppression, some fragment of authenticity still reached the paper. As the practice expanded, so did the alarm. Religious leaders urged families to maintain stricter surveillance of their daughters. Mothers were counselled to examine private compartments and wardrobes. Educational institutions began prohibiting the keeping of personal journals entirely. Yet the more forbidden the practice became, the more appealing it was. Some women began employing symbols or foreign tongues. Others wrote with disappearing ink. A few composed letters to fictional companions or religious figures, disguising their longing as devotion. There exists an account of a teacher who maintained a diary detailing her emotional connections to both her employer and the employer's spouse. She never revealed her feelings openly, but her journal captured every look, every accidental contact, every moment of imagined intimacy. When discovered, she was diagnosed with insanity. The physician who evaluated her attributed emotional instability to excessive isolation. No one acknowledged that the only confidant she ever had was her notebook. Sometimes the act of keeping a journal became evidence against them. Women found themselves sedated, confined, or forced into religious confessions simply for documenting their physical experiences. The mere act of recording thoughts about their own bodies was viewed as pathological, a spiritual sickness that required treatment. Society didn't question whether it had failed these women. Instead, it concluded they had failed to adapt properly to their circumstances. I frequently contemplate how many exceptional intellects were institutionalized, not for disruptive behavior, but for articulating their feelings on paper. In another era, these same women might have emerged as celebrated authors, counselors, or thinkers. Yet, in their time, they were considered too perceptive, too expressive, too fundamentally human. A handful of these journals remain in library collections today. Often miscategorized or buried in archival storage, they're seldom displayed for public viewing. Their writings continue to be handled as fragile, sometimes hazardous material. Yet they offer us something crucial, proof that even in the most restrictive societies, individuals discover ways to document the reality of their inner experiences. As oil lamps dimmed in quiet households and lace window treatments moved gently in the evening air, a young woman might position herself at her dressing table, clutching a pen. With unsteady fingers, she might compose a sentence, then scratch it out, attempt it again, then secure the diary with its lock, hoping desperately that no one would discover it, yet finding herself unable to cease writing. What we'll examine next reveals how Victorian women fought back against this suppression, not only through their writing, but by seizing control of their appearance in surprising ways. We'll delve into the emergence of cosmetic products sold for romantic attraction, and how what appeared to be simple fragrance and face powder often concealed something far more daring. The peculiar traditions of the Victorian period weren't limited to aristocratic bedchambers or medical prescriptions. Some were quietly imposed each dawn as women prepared for labour in homes that weren't theirs. For household staff, especially young women employed as maids, appearance regulations weren't just rigid. They were profoundly degrading. Their physical forms were considered part of the household's machinery, and the clothing they were required to wear made this brutally apparent. In countless homes, the boundary between authority and abuse became indistinguishable with every fabric thread. A housemaid's outfit might look straightforward to contemporary eyes, a dress in a plain shade, an apron, and occasionally a cap. Yet underneath this simplicity lay a calculated statement. Throughout numerous upper and middle-class residences, female servants were expected to wear lightweight cotton garments, frequently without petticoats or proper underclothing. The material was transparent enough that body contours became visible under certain lighting conditions. Though never openly acknowledged, this requirement served several functions. It emphasized class distinctions, preserved social rankings, and provided certain male household members precisely the kind of exposure they desired without having to make explicit requests. The concept that revealing less could mean more certainly didn't originate with fashion publications, but with Victorian social hierarchy enforcement. Female heads of household frequently defended the practice by claiming that plain clothing discouraged vanity or inappropriate behaviour. In their reasoning, if a maid dressed too modestly or elegantly, she might attempt social advancement or, even worse, draw masculine attention. The solution was contradictory. Compel them to wear flimsy, exposing garments that simultaneously stripped away their dignity while supposedly safeguarding the household's moral standing. In reality, the sheer dresses weren't about propriety. They were about power. A servant's visibility represented her subjugation. Some employers conducted routine inspections to verify that maids hadn't secretly added undergarments or modified their uniforms for decency. Objections from the maids were typically dismissed. They were, after all, merely village girls or ungrateful help. Their discomfort was deemed insignificant. In today's world, forcing employees to dress for humiliation would generate lawsuits, media attention, and public fury. But in Victorian drawing rooms, it was simply standard procedure for managing a proper household. The greater the control over a servant's body, the more powerful the mistress felt within her domain. Even female employers participated in this system of monitoring and degradation. They enforced strict regulations on posture, silence, and how maids were permitted to move throughout the house. Yet, it was clothing control that created the most persistent form of domination. The household's men were, predictably, not discouraged from watching. This arrangement allowed them to maintain innocence while indulging in exactly the type of observation that society publicly denounced. When a housemaid faced harassment or unwanted touching, she was seldom believed. Most remained silent, fearing termination or worse, blame. A maid who attempted to complain might find herself without a character reference. Without that reference, employment elsewhere became impossible. Certain households prohibited maids from changing clothes privately. The reasoning was that servants under constant surveillance wouldn't have opportunity or means to cause problems. In one household record, a matron boasted about providing fresh white uniforms laundered daily and distributed each morning by the head maid. However, these uniforms were constructed from gauze, and the head maid was instructed to ensure nothing was worn beneath. In particular wealthy estates, housemaids were required to serve refreshments or assist with dressing while kneeling or bending forward, positions that made their clothing's sheerness even more obvious. These duties were assigned not merely for practicality but for visual impact. The house might display paintings of idealized women in flowing garments. But the real objectification occurred in kitchens, hallways, and on staircases. What troubles me most isn't simply forcing someone to wear transparent clothing, but the quiet brutality of pretending it benefited them. Moral language became a weapon for enforcing humiliation. Protection became justification, and silence was interpreted as agreement. In this context, the servant's body wasn't her own. It belonged to the household structure. Some women tried to resist. They would stitch additional layers into their skirts or hide fabric beneath aprons. If discovered, they faced punishment or dismissal for defiance or pride. One maid wrote in a concealed letter to her sister about layering her skirts with newspaper sheets on cold mornings. The rustling sound betrayed her. She was returned to her village without wages. Rumours circulated about households where uniforms became increasingly explicit over time. In one London residence, maids received summer versions of their dresses that were sleeveless, shorter, and even more see-through. The mistress claimed it was more suitable for warm weather. The male visitors concurred. Nobody consulted the servants. Even when these practices faced questioning, supporters argued that these girls understood what they were agreeing to. The truth was, they had no alternatives. Many came from impoverished backgrounds or orphanages. Their agreements were spoken, their workdays were lengthy, their meals were scraps, and their clothing didn't belong to them. Eventually, some reformers paid attention. Letters to newspapers, often unsigned, began addressing indecent expectations in domestic employment. Religious groups established committees to protect virtuous young women. Yet change arrived slowly, and many accounts were suppressed. Today, several museum displays feature actual uniforms worn by Victorian housemaids. They rest under glass cases, neatly folded, labelled as historical garments. The mannequins have expressionless faces, yet those dresses were once worn by living, breathing women. They climbed stairs, carried heavy serving trays, comforted upset children, and endured stares they couldn't reciprocate. They performed these tasks while wearing garments that left them more vulnerable than protected. That kind of exposure wasn't accidental. It was institutional policy. What we'll explore next shows how this control expanded beyond individual households into childhood itself. We'll examine how young girls were brought to doctors to have their bodies inspected for signs of moral corruption under the pretense of medical necessity. It represents a darker development, but an inevitable one in a culture consumed with purity and anxiety. In numerous Victorian homes, deciding when to conceive wasn't left to nature. It followed regulations, ceremonies, and deeply embedded fears. Among the strangest was the conviction that intimate relations on particular weekdays, or specifically on even-numbered calendar dates, would damage any child conceived. Couples learned that timing meant everything, and the wrong moment could result in lifelong consequences. This wasn't merely folklore shared among chattering neighbours. It became a strict, often enforced domestic schedule. The belief focused on the notion that celestial patterns and calendar dates carried moral significance. By ignoring these patterns, couples risked producing offspring who were physically frail, mentally unstable, or ethically defective. In some affluent and middle-class households, families maintained handwritten charts discreetly posted inside closets or hidden in bedside tables. These conception schedules often resembled account books with red ink marking forbidden dates. Some included additional warnings like avoid for wellness or unsuitable for heirs. The concept was that only specific days were truly appropriate, and synchronizing one's behavior with these dates would guarantee a child of suitable character and health. Odd-numbered days, particularly Thursdays and Saturdays, were deemed more favourable. Even days like Monday or Wednesday were marked as unlucky. If a child born from a Monday encounter showed weakness or defiance, the mother was sometimes blamed for failing to follow the schedule. Paradoxically, a society fixated on moral regulation created superstitions to control even biological processes. These schedules weren't based on public science, but private belief. They existed in the quiet rhythms of women's daily lives, transmitted from mother to daughter through whispered guidance. In many homes, monitoring the safe days became entirely the wife's responsibility. It was part of her marital role alongside meal preparation, childcare, and maintaining public modesty. Tracking forbidden dates was considered a duty as essential as church attendance or avoiding improper dress. If the wife failed in this obligation, consequences extended beyond quiet disapproval. Some husbands grew openly resentful, treating any mistake as carelessness. The reasoning was harsh but straightforward. If a child developed problems, it couldn't be divine will or natural chance. Someone required blaming, and since women were expected to manage timing, they received the blame. Sometimes clergy were consulted for after-the-fact moral guidance. They would ask about conception timing, compare it to church calendars, and determine whether the act occurred on a prohibited date. This could result in confessions, fasting, or enforced celibacy for weeks as punishment. Compared to today's reproductive health applications and fertility tracking, this Victorian method was less scientific but far more punitive. No biological knowledge guided it, only numerological beliefs and fear of cosmic imbalance. Some couples began believing even the time of day mattered. Evening was favoured over morning. Lunar cycles were sometimes considered. In countryside areas, women might consult old farming almanacs, seeking agricultural wisdom for human conception. Stories emerged of women rising at midnight to change bedding if they realised they'd been intimate on an even date. Whether these accounts were factual or embellished, they captured the pressure on female bodies to conform to invisible schedules. Within this rigid moral structure, women rarely had freedom to voice disagreement. If a woman questioned the calendar's logic, she might be accused of being too assertive, too inquisitive, or worse, too educated. Challenging the rule meant challenging household order. Victorian society wasn't designed to welcome such challenges. Silence became a survival strategy. Women learned to agree, to record the rules, and to accept them internally. Physical intimacy between spouses wasn't necessarily guided by emotion or attraction, but by a rigid timetable that allowed no room for spontaneity. Some medical professionals of the era actually supported these beliefs, not because they had proof, but because they operated within a system that prioritized conformity over inquiry. Physicians consulted about fertility issues might ask about timing in relation to these calendars, giving professional credibility to what was essentially social mythology. By doing this, they helped strengthen the myth even further. A woman who conceived successfully on an odd-numbered day received praise for her virtue and proper timing. A woman who failed to conceive or delivered a child with apparent defects was either pitied or subtly blamed for disregarding the guidance. The emotional weight of these expectations often went unspoken. A woman might weep privately after being criticized for forgetting the calendar. She might experience persistent guilt when her child became ill, questioning whether conception timing played a part. Some women maintained private diaries recording the coordination of their intimate lives with the charts, searching for patterns, attempting to satisfy a system that was never truly supportive. Others simply surrendered, accepting the accusations as part of their destiny. It's hard not to sense that beneath all this structure lay a profound, ongoing fear of women's independence. The calendar wasn't about wellness, it was about dominance. It provided husbands and institutions a method to regulate bodies without acknowledging that was the intention. It disguised itself as tradition, wisdom, or morality. In reality, it was simply another restraint, less obvious than the corset, but equally limiting. What strikes me most about this practice isn't the peculiarity of the belief itself, but how naturally it aligns with the rest of Victorian reasoning. Everything in a woman's existence was scheduled, examined, and justified by invisible regulations. The conception calendar was merely one more regulation in an extensive list. What we'll examine next shows how Victorian morality reached even deeper into the most private marriage rituals, where bedroom rules were written more by fear than by affection. Not every attempt to suppress female sexuality during the Victorian era came from husbands, physicians, or institutions. Some were self-imposed, adopted voluntarily, even enthusiastically by women themselves. Among the most troubling of these practices was the regular consumption of so-called virtue tonics, liquids marketed to reduce emotional intensity, eliminate lustful thoughts, and preserve a woman's purity. These tonics weren't herbal infusions or gentle, soothing syrups. They contained small amounts of toxins like mercury, lead, and antimony. Women consumed them with the same sense of obligation they applied to prayer or proper behaviour. Sometimes they believed they were protecting their souls. Other times they simply wanted to survive a world that punished any visible sign of desire. These mixtures were easily obtained in urban pharmacies and rural markets. Travelling merchants advertised them under names like Virtue Tonic, Essence of Grace, or Liquid Modesty. The labels promised to calm passions, regulate feminine emotions, and restore peaceful behaviour. Some even featured testimonials allegedly written by aristocratic women, praising the tonic's ability to preserve innocence of heart and body. Women would blend the liquid with water or tea, sometimes following a rigid schedule such as a spoonful each morning and again before sleep. The tonic became part of daily routine, like combing hair or reading scripture. It's almost darkly amusing to picture a world where a woman's moral character could be bottled, branded, and sold by the fluid ounce. These tonics fit perfectly into Victorian consumer culture, which flourished on worry. There were products for lightening skin, cinching waists, and quieting children. A bottle promising to eliminate sexual desire didn't seem unusual. Many women never questioned the contents, especially if the seller claimed the ingredients originated from ancient traditions or religious sources. But the effects often appeared quickly. The same women who initially felt calmer began noticing other changes. Ongoing nausea, severe abdominal pain, fragile fingernails, and most notably, hair loss. Some of the more costly formulations included metallic compounds that, when consumed over time, damaged the body's nervous system. These symptoms were sometimes attributed to emotional stress or delicate nerves, not the poisons themselves. In severe cases, women developed sleeplessness or heart irregularities. Still, they continued consuming the tonics. The shame of being considered passionate or impure exceeded the physical suffering. Mothers introduced the practice to daughters, sometimes as part of pre-wedding preparation. Girls as young as 12 received mild doses to help them adjust to womanhood with dignity. Compared to today's wellness supplements and mental health awareness, the Victorian tonic phenomenon feels like something from a bizarre novel, yet it was real, common, and lethal. Some medical publications of the time cautiously advised against excessive use. A few doctors suspected that certain patients were being slowly poisoned by the very treatments they believed were protecting them. Yet these warnings seldom reached the women who needed them most. Even when a woman collapsed, her death might be attributed to female weakness or melancholia, not chemical poisoning. The relationship between body and mind was poorly understood, and those who tried to question it often met resistance. What made the situation even more disturbing was that many of these tonics were marketed through religious morality. Advertisements frequently included references to angels, saints, or divine purity. Drinking the tonic became a spiritual practice. Some women kept bottles on their vanity tables alongside rosaries and family treasures. Taking the dose was a ritual of both physical and moral cleansing. Sometimes it was also a quiet rebellion. A woman tired of unwanted advances from her husband might secretly use the tonic to numb her reactions, finding it easier to fulfill her marital obligations without resistance. What breaks your heart is how completely these women absorbed the idea that their emotions were destructive forces. Even the most natural physical reactions were viewed as threats to their standing, their marriages, or their spiritual salvation. Through self-poisoning, they believed they could eliminate the source of trouble entirely. This wasn't considered self-harm, but rather noble sacrifice. Unlike obvious control methods such as tight-laced corsets or chastity devices, these remedies left almost no visible traces. The agony remained hidden, occurring in private, without protest or recognition. A handful of reformers did eventually raise their voices. During the later Victorian years, some feminist writers started challenging the tonic industry, releasing leaflets and opinion pieces that condemned selling poisonous substances to women under the guise of moral improvement. Yet their readership remained limited, and opposition was overwhelming. Manufacturers simply rebranded their products, adopting more clinical terminology like nerve stabilizer or soothing remedy. Some even secured recommendations from well-regarded doctors who presented them as mental health tools rather than moral suppression devices. The cruelest irony was that many women interpreted their suffering as evidence the medicine was effective. They viewed the hair thinning, loss of appetite, and insomnia as signs of their spiritual progress. When their bodies hurt, they believed their souls were mending. Nobody challenged this belief. Nobody assured them that womanhood didn't require constant self-destruction. It would be many years before this understanding became widespread, and even then, it didn't reach everyone. What haunts this historical period most is the complete silence. Women consumed these remedies in isolation, endured pain alone, and frequently passed away without realizing they'd been deceived. There were no ceremonies. For the parts of themselves they surrendered to appear righteous, no tributes to the happiness they were conditioned to reject. Not every transgressive act in Victorian romance involved physical proximity. Some occurred through folded letters, delicate fabrics, and the subtle sound of paper envelopes. In a culture where even premarital kissing could destroy one's reputation, couples discovered covert methods to communicate yearning. Among the strangest and most dangerous was mailing undergarments through the postal service. Intimate clothing wasn't merely personal property. It became a representation of faith, passion, and silent defiance. Lovers exchanged it as proof, as evidence of closeness that couldn't be voiced openly. But what was intended to remain confidential sometimes sparked controversy when discovered. This custom originated in wealthy social circles, among people with sufficient discretion to engage in forbidden letter writing. A woman might slip a delicate handkerchief, a narrow petticoat tie, or in more daring instances, an actual piece of her intimate apparel into a letter and mail it to her betrothed or clandestine admirer. Sometimes the material was lightly perfumed or held against her skin before shipping. These mementos were designed to ignite fantasy, to evoke memories of contact and flesh. In a society of rigid etiquette and restraint, the item arrived like a murmur, not a declaration. But as with many Victorian customs, the boundary between romance and disgrace was incredibly narrow. The instant someone else discovered the contents, everything changed. What had been a personal vow now became classified as indecent matter. Male inspectors, authorised by decency regulations, would sometimes examine questionable correspondence, particularly from addresses already linked to immoral behaviour. When they discovered undergarments, especially those with romantic or suggestive messages, the sender could face charges for distributing obscene materials. There's something deeply ironic about a culture that couldn't tolerate a piece of clean fabric in the mail, yet accepted arsenic remedies openly displayed. The system regulated not harm, but embarrassment. Women involved in this practice faced harsher punishments. A man might receive a fine or warning. A woman, though, risked much worse. She could be branded as loose, fired from household positions, or expelled from her social community. In smaller communities, local rumours travelled faster than legal notices. One letter could ruin everything. This phenomenon flourished during the peak of romantic sentimentalism, when verses, lockets, and dried flowers were common gifts between sweethearts. But unlike poems or pictures, lingerie carried an unmistakably physical suggestion. It served both as a substitute for the person and a breach of social expectations. Some young women thought it demonstrated commitment, particularly if marriage was already arranged. Others used it to explore the limits of their independence. But for every pair that saw it as intimacy, there was a critic prepared to transform it into corruption. In an era when physical contact was prohibited, the mail system became the venue for many of the period's quietest sexual rebellions. Lovers lived great distances apart. Courtship occurred under watchful eyes. Mailing lingerie became a method to circumvent those restrictions without leaving home. It was risky, certainly, but also strangely secure. It was simple to hide behind false identities, to ship items without traceable return information. For some, the excitement came not just from the object, but from the possibility of detection. When incidents were exposed, newspapers typically reported them with a blend of moral outrage and voyeuristic interest. Headlines described the events with vague condemnation, using phrases like improper fabric or unseemly mail. The specific details were seldom published, but that didn't prevent readers from speculating. Moral organisations responded by demanding stricter examination of women's correspondence, proposing that unmarried ladies shouldn't be permitted to send personal packages whatsoever. Some postal facilities adopted informal procedures for additional inspection of letters that appeared too thick or fragrant. It's both ridiculous and tragic that so many women's affectionate gestures were transformed into legal proof of impurity. The act of sharing something intimate was meant to maintain connection, not create scandal. Yet in courtrooms, the very intimacy of the gesture became its condemnation. Judges pointed to the fabric's softness or the presence of fragrance as evidence of indecency. A heartfelt message became criminal documentation, and predictably it was the woman's motivation that faced scrutiny, not the man's response. In occasional instances, the sender claimed ignorance. She insisted the item was intended as humour or a laundry error. Others collapsed during proceedings, admitting their emotions and pleading for mercy. Penalties varied from monetary fines to brief incarceration. But the true price was social. Being recognised as the woman who mailed her undergarments meant permanent surveillance. Even if cleared of charges, she was rarely forgiven. Still, the practice persisted. It simply went further underground. Lovers started concealing undergarments in hollowed books or stitching them into envelope linings. Others employed go-betweens, reliable friends who would send items from distant cities. Some included only pieces, like torn lace edges or corset buttons. These small tokens allowed them to maintain the tradition while minimising danger. The cleverness with which these messages travelled demonstrates how powerful the urge was to connect, even in a society bent on separation. What remains from this tale isn't the scandal but the resourcefulness. These were individuals who discovered ways to express love and longing in a world that refused to acknowledge either. They created their vocabulary from thread and paper, a quiet rebellion woven into fabric. And though their letters might have been confiscated, their yearning couldn't be suppressed. In the restrictive world of Victorian romance, one principle governed almost every encounter between men and women. Behind closed doors, only the man was permitted to experience desire. Female passion, when it emerged, wasn't celebrated as evidence of mutual attraction. It was regarded as a mistake, a threat, or even worse, a medical condition. For a woman to acknowledge pleasure was to risk being labelled unstable, blamed for moral failure, or quietly ostracised. Her function was to tolerate, not to relish. The common assumption was that decent women were naturally uninterested in sex. Any display of eagerness challenged that fiction and endangered the entire moral structure of the era. Female pleasure had no role in public conversation, no recognition in proper education, and definitely no acceptance in medicine. If a woman showed excessive affection toward her husband or too much anticipation in private moments, it was frequently blamed on nervous disorder or secret vice. Doctors recommended rest. Religious leaders recommended confession. Families recommended silence. Some medical professionals even claimed that a woman smiling after intimacy could indicate early hysteria. That smile, rather than representing connection, became a medical concern to be addressed, and if she took initiative or showed interest before her husband, the humiliation could be crushing. It was deemed unnatural for a wife to desire. Her obligation was to comply, nothing beyond. Meanwhile, men were not only permitted but expected to desire. Entire handbooks were published for husbands, teaching them how to arouse their wives, but never questioning whether they wanted arousal. These manuals stressed technique, patience, and dominance, but ignored consent completely. They presumed that all women, even the most reluctant, would eventually embrace the experience. It was simply about timing and proper approach. The idea that a woman might genuinely not want intimacy didn't align with their worldview. This arrangement created an odd silence around female experiences. A woman couldn't ask questions, show curiosity, or admit feelings without jeopardizing her reputation. If she confided in another woman, she might face confusion or criticism. If she consulted a physician, she might be referred for treatment. The safest approach for most was pretense. Many women learned to appear indifferent even when they weren't, or to completely suppress what they couldn't express. Picture a world where pleasure brought punishment and silence earned praise, and you'll start to grasp the burden many women bore. That silence wasn't passivity, but survival strategy. To speak freely, to want openly, was simply too perilous. Even within marriage, female pleasure wasn't the objective. If a husband suspected his wife enjoyed the experience excessively, he might grow suspicious. Was she experienced? Was she secretly immoral? These doubts hung in the atmosphere and made openness nearly impossible. The more a woman attempted honesty, the greater her risk of being accused of moral failure. And if she showed no reaction whatsoever, that too was considered proper. Victorian society preferred women to be emotionally detached and physically motionless. The less they responded, the more virtuous they seemed. Desire was meant to stay buried, hidden beneath corsets, tradition, and terror. What strikes me most about this entire narrative is how thoroughly happiness was replaced by shame. In a time when industrial advancement filled the streets, emotional advancement within homes was stopped cold. Women were conditioned not to feel, or at minimum, not to reveal it. And when they did, the system stood ready to correct them. Naturally, not every couple obeyed these rules. Private acts of resistance occurred. Some women did discover love and freedom in marriage, but they did so quietly, often with considerable risk and without public recognition. Their pleasure had to remain secret, even from themselves. As the era advanced, some voices started to resist. Early feminists and reformers questioned the contradictory standards. Medical experts gradually revised their perspectives. Literature started to suggest more complex, more compassionate depictions of female desire. But the shadows of shame and scrutiny didn't disappear quickly. They persisted across generations. With this final principle, the strange, suppressed, and often harsh sexual environment of the Victorian era becomes clear. It was a world shaped not by technological limitations, but by bodily fear and self-terror. Every rule we've examined was founded on controlling touch, thought, and emotion. And nowhere was that control more ruthlessly enforced than in the conviction that women must not desire. Now that we've completed this quiet journey into one of history's most peculiar chapters, may your night be free from corsets, chastity devices, and hidden anxieties. Thank you for accompanying me through these unusual stories. Rest peacefully, and may your dreams be gentler than Victorian propriety ever permitted.